1 week later.
So you become a little critical of this whole capitalism thing. Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn lost their elections, the liberal politicians suck donkey balls, and you feel a little disenchanted. Maybe you get radicalized and go down the communist rabbit hole and discover a whole new universe online.
The critique of ideology.
You get exposed to this vast marketplace of political ideologies, and you find out about these niches like BreadTube or BeardTube. You've probably also noticed a lot of people on Twitter self-identifying with various communist labels. And you might be thinking, what do all these ideologies mean? What do they stand for? Orthodox Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, Trotskyism, left communism, Maoism, Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, Libertarian Communism, MAGA Communism? Yeah, apparently that's a thing.
Corporate communism.
Yeah, that's not a thing. Or maybe you're just a healthy, normal person who isn't terminally online and is just curious about the history of Marxism and its many different variants.
Do I have to be a communist to read Karl Marx?
Either because you find yourself to be a communist sympathizer, or you just hate all this commie gobbledygook and want to get to know your enemy better.
Sounds like some commie gobbledygook.
Maybe you're somebody who thinks they're already familiar with all these ideologies, and thinks they have figured it all out.
Everyone is stupid except me.
And you're trying to see which ideology that I identify with. Spoiler alert, none of them. There's something for everybody in this video. CIA, if you're watching this, you can get something out of this video too. And this is why I can be relatively unbiased when covering this topic. Because due to morbid fixation, I have spent way too much time reading about all this stuff and spending a lot of time in these sort of Marxist circles to get to know them.
You're a first-year grad student. You just got finished reading some Marxian historian.
There are many types of communism, but in this video we are just going to be going over the main types of Marxism. And you'd be surprised just how many factional splits there are. There are more types of Marxism than there are Marxists.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 million.
And there really isn't a good comprehensive guide out there that goes over all of them accurately from a relatively unbiased view. Now you could spend the time to read about each and every one of them by yourself.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And you might just find yourself getting stuck in a crazy cult or in a red goth phase. This is going to be kind of like an iceberg video, starting with the most historically significant tendencies. By the end of the video, you might find which flavor of Marxism speaks to you.
Christ be with you.
Or you might just find them all cringe. Either way, I can assure you that you'll get a lot of insight into learning about all these different tendencies. So grab a beer, popcorn, a blunt, whatever suits you, as we dive straight into the rabbit hole. Now, as Karl Marx's mother once said,
if Karl spent as much time making capital as he did writing about it, then he would be a very rich man.
And I don't got that Soros money or the she-bucks to fund this video. So this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. If you want to protect against the big corporate communist tyranny, then better get yourself a VPN. With Surfshark, you can encrypt your internet connections so that no government can track what you're doing online. And it protects you from creepy data miners who might be trying to sell your data to private companies. You don't want that. And it even lets you bypass geo restrictions so that you can access content freely from anywhere, regardless of what country you live in. And let's be honest, if there's one thing that communists hate more than capitalism, it's borders. Well, I guess that depends. For real though, I use this all the time, and it can come in handy when using American Netflix as a Canadian, or downloading theory books, legally, of course. So click that link in the description to get access to 4 months free on Surfshark VPN using the code ONEDIME. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you are unsatisfied, you can always get your money back. Remember, Big Brother is always watching you. Alright, let's get back to explaining what all this commie gobbledygook is all about. Leninism was, of course, the political doctrine associated with Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party. And no, Leninism is not to be confused with Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism wasn't formally invented until after Lenin's death. Many Marxist tendencies are influenced by Vladimir Lenin that aren't Marxism-Leninism, like Trotskyism and certain forms of left communism and various non-sectarian Marxisms. Oh, don't worry, we'll get back to Marxism-Leninism later.
Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
Originally, Lenin just considered himself to be a Russian Marxist aiming to apply Marxist ideas to the unique socio-political conditions of Russia. and to put forth what he believed to be was the correct interpretation of Marxism.
Using a party with a movement, comrade, they're not the same thing.
But of course, Lenin would go on to make some hugely influential contributions to Marxist theory that would lead to Leninism becoming a comprehensive political doctrine of its own that would be considered a novel variant of Marxism to be distinguished from all other types of Marxism. Leninism became the glue of the Bolshevik Party, which took power in October of 1917, and eventually became the ruling party of the Soviet Union. Leninism and Bolshevism aren't exactly the same thing, but you could say that Bolshevism is 100% Leninist, but all Leninists aren't necessarily Bolsheviks. But most certainly, you could obviously say the Bolsheviks were the first Leninist party. This is why Leninism is often used synonymously with Bolshevism, even though this ideology would mutate considerably after Lenin's death. At its core, Leninism is a form of Marxism in power. It was the first time in modern history when the working class, or at least a political party representing the working class, was the ruling party in power. It is why it is considered to be the first proletarian revolution. But of course, Russia was primarily peasants, and the revolution was shaped not just by workers, but also by peasants. This is why the communist flag includes the hammer and the sickle. The hammer representing the working class, the proletariat, and the sickle representing the peasantry. This flag was born out of the Worker-Peasant Alliance, which was seen as necessary in order for the revolution to succeed, because the working class was simply far too small for the revolution to be based solely on it. Leninism emerged through what was essentially a crisis in Orthodox Marxism. Previously, Marxists saw capitalism as a progressive development. Despite its brutal exploitation, environmental destruction, and chaotic boom and bust cycles, capitalism created a lot of wealth, which led to the rapid development of productive forces. Classical Marxists believed that society needed to be already wealthy and technologically advanced enough before it was ready for socialism. You need to have wealth before you can distribute it, after all. And they believed that all this wealth was being produced on the backs of a growing alienated proletariat who would become the new revolutionary subject. And when capitalist crisis would reach a breaking point, they would be the class with the most self-interest and the most power to opt for a revolution. They would have the self-interest because they had nothing to lose but their chains, as they owned nothing but their own labor. And unlike the peasantry, they actually had the power to organize and bring production to a halt. But by the 20th century, it had become increasingly clear that Marx's predictions hadn't exactly panned out. The anticipated proletarian revolutions in advanced Western nations were nowhere to be found. Enter your boy Vladimir Lenin,
Must crush capitalism.
who had to somehow figure out how to build a revolution in a country like Russia, which was about as far from the ideal preconditions for socialism that Marx considered were necessary in order for socialism to be possible. We're talking about a semi-feudal country with a mostly peasant population and barely any industrial proletariat. In the build-up to 1917, many Marxists at the time had agreed that the situation in Russia was ripe for major changes, just not a socialist revolution. The best that Russia could hope for was a completion of its bourgeois democratic revolution.
From the Volinsky and Pavlovsky regiments!
But Lenin believed that socialist revolution was possible in Russia. And his conviction was driven by his observation that capitalism was entering its imperialist stage. In his famous book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin built on the ideas of his fellow Bolshevik comrade Nikolai Bukharin, and extended Marxist theory by analyzing imperialism as a newer stage in capitalist development. In this stage of monopoly capitalism, the biggest corporations are no longer content with just dominating their home countries. They have to expand globally. Governments use their military power to extract resources from third world countries and open up new markets. The falling rate of profit inherent to capitalist companies and the constant drive for expansion among different capitalist empires meant that the interests of different capitalist nations will inevitably come into conflict.
Any war undertaken by a capitalist government is imperialism. Hasn't the clown read any books?
The contradictions of imperialism, the exploitation of colonies, the crushing of workers' rights, the endless wars, meant that revolution was indeed possible, desirable, and necessary, not just for Russia, but for the world. And contrary to what Marx originally thought, these revolutions would not start in the most advanced capitalist nations, but rather in the exploited periphery, the colonized countries, because the expansion of imperialism would lead to super profits that would lead to a much more well-paid working class and what Lenin called a labor aristocracy, a section of the working class that was much more well-paid relative to the rest of the working class, which would serve to divide the working class and make them less prone to revolution, unlike the exploited classes of the colonized world who would have nothing to lose. This flipped classical Marxist conceptions on their head. But what was to be done? If all this was inevitable, would revolution be inevitable? Unlike most communists of his time, Lenin was skeptical of the idea of revolutionary spontaneity, an idea held by many radicals at the time, which was that the masses themselves would make revolution spontaneously from the bottom up. In his major text, What is to be Done, Lenin observed that many working class movements were stuck in what he called trade union consciousness, meaning that workers' organizations generally just opted for short-term compromises, like wage increases, and better workers' rights, rather than striving for the long-term goal of revolution, to overthrow the system entirely and replace it with a new socialist one. This was a tendency that Lenin observed with the working class in virtually all capitalist countries. But the case with Russia was even worse, because Russia barely had a proletariat to begin with. Even though the country had a quite revolutionary situation, most of its people were peasants. Lenin's answer? The Vanguard Party, a tightly centralized, disciplined group of professional revolutionaries. This party would spearhead class consciousness and lead the proletariat to revolution. The Vanguard Party would provide the political education and direction needed for revolution. The structure of this type of party is quite hierarchical, and although there's supposed to be democracy within the Vanguard Party, once a decision is made by that party, party loyalty must be strictly adhered to, with people following the party line. This conception of how a party was supposed to work is often called democratic centralism.
How can we improve its work?
What's wrong with its work? Function is growing faster than its structure. It's the practical problems of party organization.
Unlike Orthodox Marxists, who viewed class struggle as a gradual process tied to economic development, Lenin argued that the revolutionary conditions could be accelerated through the strategic intervention by this Vanguard Party. In other words, this Vanguard Party was supposed to make an intervention into history. Lenin was well aware that Russia didn't exactly have the prime conditions for socialism, but his hope was that the Russian Revolution would trigger socialist upheaval in advanced capitalist countries, particularly in Europe. But this just didn't pan out. The German Revolution of 1919 was defeated. Attempted revolutions elsewhere were also crushed and overthrown, like in Poland and Finland. So as the revolution failed in the First World, Lenin turned his eyes to the developing world. Lenin's prediction that revolution would emanate from the Third World proved to be true, as what happened wasn't so much communist revolutions but national liberation movements. Leninism would go on to influence various revolutionaries in the Third World, where Marx and Engels did not consider socialism to be possible, like China, Vietnam, and various countries in Latin America. Now keep in mind, at this time, Leninism still wasn't thought of as a thing. You had revolutionaries across the world trying to implement Marxism in their respective ways. But after the establishment of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks were able to claim that their model of Marxism actually worked while the rest didn't, even though the failure of Marxism elsewhere was of course due to much more complex factors, not just ideas. After Lenin's death, Stalin coined the term Marxism-Leninism and codified it as the official ideology of the Soviet state. The Comintern, also known as the Communist International or the Third International, a global association of communist parties founded in 1919 by the Soviet Union, would try to export communist influence worldwide, and in doing so, they would choose to mainly prop up communist parties that would agree to abide by official Marxist-Leninist doctrine. This export of Marxist-Leninist ideology globally would lead to Marxism-Leninism eventually triumphing over all other Marxist ideologies, becoming the dominant form of doctrinaire Marxism. Now, some people believe that Stalin betrayed the revolution and distorted Lenin's legacy, while others believe that Stalin merely took Leninism to its logical conclusion. The most notorious faction of Marxism that subscribes to the betrayal narrative is, of course, Trotskyism. Trotskyism is a Marxist ideology based on the ideas and theories of course, Leon Trotsky, a prominent Russian revolutionary, Marxist theorist, and key leader in the October Revolution of 1917. Trotsky was of course in the Bolshevik Party and was a rival of Joseph Stalin.
Trotsky wasted his last chance to stop my father.
When Stalin took power,
He underestimated the man he called a mule.
And Trotsky was criticizing Stalin's policies. He basically got exiled, he went to Mexico, and then Stalin's secret police basically gave him an ice pick to the head. R.I.P. After Trotsky's death, many Trotskyist groups formed. Trotskyists are notorious for sectarian splits. Get 3 Trotskyists in a room and you get 4 different political parties. But notwithstanding their differences, there are some core beliefs that Trotskyist groups generally all share, most of which come directly from Trotsky himself. Trotskyism is centered on internationalism, permanent revolution, and opposition to bureaucracy. Most importantly, Trotskyism is defined by a defense of Leninism but an opposition to Stalinism. Trotsky believed that the idea of socialism just existing in one country was impossible. He believed it required a global revolution in order to survive. The success of socialism depends on the revolution spreading internationally in many different countries, especially the developed ones, with developed and less developed countries supporting one another. Otherwise, a socialist revolution would be doomed and encircled by imperialist powers. This internationalist idea, although associated with Trotsky, is closer to the original ideas of Marx himself. Because capitalism was a global socioeconomic order, it only made sense to them that transitioning to socialism would also be an international project. Trotsky saw revolution as a continuous global process with the ultimate goal of creating a worldwide socialist system. This is his idea of permanent revolution. He didn't think you could just develop a socialist state in one country and then keep it like that. For Trotsky, he was all about revolution all the time. Sometimes you wonder that, in Trotsky's world, would the workers just not get tired of revolution all the time? In his most famous book, The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky also criticized the totalitarian bureaucratic nature of the Soviet Union under Stalin, calling it a, quote, degenerated workers' state. He believed that it was a dictatorship of the proletariat to a certain extent, but it was more so a dictatorship of a proletarian party over the proletariat, and that the bureaucracy had basically become a new ruling class that was separated and distant from the proletariat. Trotsky still believed in the dictatorship of the party, though. He more or less agreed with all the Leninist principles, but he did believe in democracy within the party. And most importantly for Trotsky, this party had to represent the proletariat. But he basically thought that this party democracy had turned into a dictatorship of one man and his allies. Trotsky was not anti-Soviet. He was not an opponent of Soviet power. While he gave scathing critiques of Stalin's leadership and believed that the Soviet Union had many problems, he did not altogether condemn it. He actually defended the experiment until the day he died. But see, Trotsky was a mixed bag. In The Revolution Betrayed, which was the book he wrote after he got exiled, Trotsky advocated for greater workers' democracy and checks on the power of the bureaucracy. This is why many people have the impression of Trotsky being the more democratic, humane, and sophisticated alternative compared to Joseph Stalin. Trotsky is like the ultimate alpha nerd archetype. Military commander, intellectual, put Marxism into practice. He has a track record until he got ice-picked by Stalin. I mean, what's there not to like about the guy? And he didn't have to get his hands dirty by holding power. Trotsky is a symbol of what could have been and a fantasy for alternative history nerds who want to believe that maybe the Soviet Union would have been less shitty if he was in charge. Now, while Trotsky and Stalin never really liked each other, the reality was that Trotsky didn't come to his more democratic and anti-bureaucratic positions until it was far too late. It wasn't really till he got purged from the party and sent into exile where he actually came to his senses about democracy. Before that, Trotsky actually supported policies that were very close to what would become some of Stalin's worst policies 10 years later, such as forced collectivization, which Trotsky advocated already in the 1920s. And if you read his book Terrorism and Communism, you'll see that Trotsky does not care about democracy or checks on power whatsoever. Although Trotskyist parties never really got around to succeeding in making a revolution anywhere, Trotskyism has tended to be one of the more popular strands of Marxism in Western democracies, which really isn't saying a lot. And of course, if you embrace Trotskyism, you can say, oh, that Stalin guy? Oh, I have nothing to do with him. I hate him. Soviet Union, bad. But Trotskyism allows one to pretty much keep all the core tenets of Leninism without the Stalin baggage. It's a grand narrative where Stalin is able to play the villain and Trotsky is the tragic hero who could have maybe just made everything better if he was in power. Trotskyism provides a very attractive grand narrative to explain what went wrong with the history of Marxism. It gives them an explanation for what went wrong with the history of socialism without having to rethink much of the core tenets of Marxism or Leninism. Marxism-Leninism is arguably the most historically significant strand of Marxism, in that it was adopted by a wide variety of regimes. Marxism-Leninism has also experienced somewhat of a revival in recent years, for better or for worse. However, most people don't really know about the history of Marxism-Leninism or what Marxist-Leninists, known as MLs, are all about, including many MLs themselves. Marxism-Leninism isn't just Marx plus Lenin. The term Marxism-Leninism was actually coined by Joseph Stalin. It became the legitimating ideology of the Soviet regime. Stalin is credited for synthesizing Marxism-Leninism, particularly in his book called The Foundations of Leninism. It was primarily Stalin and his supporters who standardized Marxism-Leninism as the guiding doctrine of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU. The formation of Marxism-Leninism was meant to establish a continuity from Marx and Engels to Lenin to Stalin, effectively sidelining other interpretations of Marxism and other factions within the Bolshevik Party, which were all gradually eliminated. But if Lenin didn't invent the term Marxism-Leninism, how did it become the dominant version of Marxism, the one that was adopted by almost all of the Soviet regimes, at least for a certain point? Well, that answer is largely due to geopolitics. Countries or political parties that wanted Soviet aid had to embrace the particular kind of Marxism that the Soviet Union was championing. That's why Fidel Castro, who initially came to power not as a communist, but as a progressive nationalist, eventually adopted the label Marxism-Leninism in order to help get Soviet aid when they needed it against American intervention. And it also became the dominant form of Marxism because of this thing called the Comintern. The Comintern was sort of like the ideological mouthpiece of the Soviet Union. It was the propaganda tool of getting out its message and providing various political parties around the world with instructions and support. They sort of exported their particular model of socialism to various places, and this helped bolster the Soviet Union's legitimacy and its sphere of influence, but it also made it so this very particular form of Marxism became the dominant form of Marxism. I would say it's more of a regime legitimating ideology rather than an actual ideology of revolution, because it wasn't conceived in the midst of trying to make revolution, but rather in the process of governing a regime and legitimating that regime's rule. Leninism was an ideology of revolution in third world countries. Marxism-Leninism is an ideology of regime legitimation. It's an ideology to justify the existence of the Soviet Communist Party and why they're doing what they're doing. Because remember, they weren't elected. Most countries get their legitimacy through elections. You know, you hate what we do? Too bad, buddy. You elected us. Stick with it. Suck it. But in the Soviet Union, where, there wasn't really election of parties, they legitimized themselves on the basis that they were a communist party, a dictatorship of the proletariat, trying to take people towards this communism thing. And it was to go through stages, going through the stage of socialism, gradually to communism. Eventually, socialism just got watered down to mean the raising of living standards. And when these living standards were no longer rising, they got in trouble. Marxism-Leninism has been claimed by a wide variety of regimes, parties, and leaders who have very different politics. Many different regimes have claimed to be Marxist-Leninist at different points in history. The Soviet Union, Mao's China, Vietnam, Mongolia, Afghanistan, Hoxha's Albania, East Germany, Tito's Yugoslavia, and the whole Eastern Bloc of Soviet states all claimed Marxism-Leninism as their official ideology, despite having major differences. I mean, the USSR and China almost went to war, for God's sake. Vietnam and China also almost went to war. And Tito and Stalin were always trying to kill each other. Meanwhile, Albania was all the way in the corner by itself, just chilling, doing its own thing. Oh, and then there's Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. That was an absolute shit show. Oh, and when it comes to Marxism-Leninism, for some reason, barely anybody talks about the entire continent of Africa. A bunch of African countries also had regimes ruled by groups that called themselves Marxist-Leninist, like Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Somalia, Madagascar, and Burkina Faso. Some say that many of the Marxist-Leninist groups who took power in these countries just called themselves Marxist-Leninist in order to get Soviet weapons, which they used to fight off the European colonizers, as well as their political rivals who were also vying for power. And it was a real way to get Soviet aid. However, which parties really believed in Marxism-Leninism and which ones did not is sometimes difficult to tell. Despite undergoing profound changes like the implementation of market reforms, countries like modern China, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba are all ruled by parties that still claim to be Marxist-Leninist to this very day. What do all these highly different regimes even have in common with each other that makes them Marxist-Leninist? There are indeed some features that the various Marxist-Leninist regimes had in common, even if you think that they were just Marxist in name only. One of these features is, of course, the one-party rule. Marxism-Leninism could best be described as the attempt to turn Leninism into an official regime ideology, to legitimize the power of the ruling party, the party state. In Marxist-Leninist states, there was usually no separation between party and state. They had a monopoly on political power. They were supposed to be the only legitimate party allowed to rule. And the rule was often codified into constitutional law. Like, literally their rule is built into the constitution. In these sort of one-party state systems, the Communist Party basically became the ruling elite. They had privileges that the majority of the population did not have. Nationalism and isolationism are also notable features of Marxist-Leninist regimes. Originally, Marxism was all about the international proletarian revolution. Workers of the world unite. But this didn't go that far. The fact of the matter is that virtually every single regime that called itself Marxist-Leninist or communist ended up embracing nationalism. And many of the Marxist-Leninist regimes that were established originally came out of national liberation movements, not communist revolutions. Cuba, Vietnam, and China are such examples. And of course, another feature of Marxist-Leninist regimes is what is known as the command economy. Basically, total state control of everything. The state controlled virtually all industries and set production targets to meet social needs. But eventually, these didn't really meet people's needs. However, China, Vietnam, and to a lesser extent even Cuba have since moved away from these sort of economic models and now have a mixed economy, with both socialistic and capitalistic aspects. Marxism-Leninism has undoubtedly influenced socialist movements around the world. However, the systems that have been produced in its name have been criticized for their bureaucratic inefficiency, suppression of dissent, and deviations from Marx's original vision. Yet for those who defend Marxism-Leninism, these regimes represented a pragmatic approach to achieving socialism under real-world constraints. Marxist-Leninists often claim that all the things that happened under these regimes, whether it be famines, mismanagement, repression of dissent, all had a reason. And they often use Marx's original historical materialist framework to justify this, by saying that they had to overcome contradictions and objective material constraints. And because of these objective laws of history and these objective conditions, there was no way these regimes could exist without having to resort to these sort of actions. These actions were inevitable consequences of this. However, many Marxist-Leninists do in fact critique these regimes for their excesses, but they rarely ever reject the overall systems and models that they were based on entirely. For them, the problem with these regimes was a matter of policy differences and excesses, not its overall vision. However, when it comes to Marxist-Leninist ideology, there are also a faction of MLs who do not consider these regimes to be socialists at all. Rather, they consider them to be revisionists. This brings us to the distinction between anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists and what I call the generic Marxist-Leninists. Basically, the generic MLs tend to support most, if not all, regimes that have a red flag. That is, regimes that call themselves Marxist-Leninist. Anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists basically emerged as Marxist-Leninist purists after Stalin died. Those who adhere to this sort of thinking will often be critical of past socialist regimes and the current ones, but for reasons that you might not expect. In the weird world of communism today, you often encounter two types of Marxist-Leninists. First, the general Marxist-Leninist camp, being the far more common type, and the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist camp, which are sort of like the ML purists who consider themselves to be the true followers of Marxism-Leninism. According to these types, the general Marxist-Leninists are revisionists. Generally speaking, the general Marxist-Leninists are rather indifferent to this label of revisionist. The anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists are sort of a dying breed nowadays. Most of them have moved into the Maoist camp by this point, which we'll talk about later. While the differences between these two variants of Marxism-Leninism might just seem like semantic hair-splitting, they're actually quite important, and the differences are honestly fascinating. And it is a super important split in the history of communism. So on the one hand, you have the general Marxist-Leninists, who are essentially the pragmatist catch-all tendency of the Marxist world. So pragmatic that, with a straight face, they'll simultaneously defend Stalin's anti-revisionist purges and Deng Xiaoping's capitalist market reforms, Mao's Cultural Revolution against the capitalist roaders, and Xi Jinping's Confucian socialism with Chinese characteristics, the USSR's central planning, and China's dismantlement of collective agriculture in favor of factories open to Western capital, all while claiming the legacy of Che Guevara, a Marxist-Leninist who criticized the Soviet Union for being too capitalist, for trying to compete with the United States on capitalist terms. Seriously though, while it may seem like MLs are willing to support any regime with a red flag, according to their perspective, all of these experiments represented cases of actually existing socialism. They aren't perfect, and we ain't gotta defend everything, but it's the best we got. At least that's how they see things. So while they might provide some light critiques of these regimes here and there, at the end of the day, Marxist-Leninists tend to defend virtually all regimes that are officially governed by Marxist-Leninist parties, that claim to be socialists and are advancing towards socialism. This includes Marxist-Leninist regimes of the past and present, including the USSR from Stalin to Brezhnev, Communist China from Mao to Xi, and Vietnam from Ho Chi Minh to Ho Chi Minh Stock Index? Yep, that's a thing. They really called it that. Even though China and Vietnam have embraced what are objectively capitalist reforms, general Marxist-Leninists believe that these regimes are still nonetheless socialist because they define socialism itself as being a transitional state. And they believe the official Communist Party's claim to be advancing towards communism or a more advanced stage of socialism. By 2024, 2050, 2070, or whatever future date the ruling party decides to postpone it to next. Basically, the pitch is that these countries need to develop the productive forces and get rich enough before communism is possible. And fair enough. As you might recall, Marx himself did think that you needed to get rich enough before socialism was possible. But he didn't call the process of getting rich itself socialism. That's a Marxist-Leninist intervention. But MLs will say that these reforms aren't really capitalism in the Western sense because it's being done by a proletarian dictatorship for the people. The people's billionaires, bruh. For real though, Canada and America could learn a thing or two from how China builds trains so damn fast. But is China socialist? Leave a comment as to what you think. Is Marxism-Leninism just a regime ideology to legitimize the authority of a political party desperate to hold on to power? And is being a Marxist-Leninist nowadays just an aesthetic? Many people don't take Marxism-Leninism seriously and dismiss it as a terminally online phenomenon or just a bunch of kids playing dress-up. And I can see why they think that. However, it very much is a growing ideology. Whether it will manifest in anything is a whole other story. But because most people don't take Marxism-Leninism seriously, they usually don't engage with it and try to refute their arguments, which ends up allowing Marxist-Leninists to seclude themselves into an echo chamber, where their views are rarely challenged. It may seem bizarre how Marxist-Leninists today try to reconcile the very contradictory legacies of Marxist-Leninist leaders and regimes, and try to defend policies that blatantly contradict the stated goals of Marxism. However, from the modern Marxist-Leninist perspective, China and Vietnam's market reforms represent pragmatic adaptations of Marxist theory, not violations of it. According to them, Marxist theory put in practice was always about navigating the contradictions and material conditions of the historical process. The intellectual rationalization for this remarkable flexibility lies in the Marxist-Leninist interpretation of dialectical materialism, a supposedly scientific framework that studies history as a process driven by the contradictions within material conditions. Marxist-Leninists often deploy historical materialism like a Swiss army knife to rationalize just about any policy that a communist party implements as part of the socialist transition. And for any of the MLs rushing to the comment section right now telling me to read X or Y Marxist-Leninist text, trust me, I've read quite a lot of the Marxist-Leninist literature. I've read Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, Xi Jinping's Manifesto, and even this big-ass official state-sanctioned Vietnamese textbook on Marxism-Leninism. I just think that, as a matter of principle, it's not very wise to take official state propaganda at face value. Now, to be fair, while Marxist-Leninists don't necessarily defend every action that Marxist-Leninist regimes have undertaken, they generally insist on framing atrocities as either excesses that were inevitable because of the material conditions, or necessary responses to counter-revolutionary threats. The psychological appeal of being a general ML isn't hard to understand. There's something deeply satisfying about cheering for what appears to be a winning team. And even though the previous Marxist-Leninist regimes all fell like dominoes, which Marxist-Leninists generally like to blame mostly on Gorbachev and CIA-backed color revolutions, general Marxism-Leninism remains appealing because there was a real legacy there. Why put in the effort to think of new alternatives when you can just point to something that had already worked? That is, until it didn't. In a world where most radical socialist projects have either been defeated, failed, or remained confined to small-scale experiments, it is perfectly understandable why many people want to believe in an ideological doctrine with pre-given answers, and a political legacy associated with powerful states with concrete historical achievements, rather than just some fringe movements with some very marginal victories at best, or a bunch of innovative theories that sound good on paper but haven't been tried in practice. In this regard, Marxism-Leninism often functions as more of a legitimation story rather than a doctrine for revolutionary politics, a regime ideology and a legitimation story that both preserves party legitimacy and gives true believers in actually existing socialism something that they can portray as a success story, even as the goalpost for what passes as socialism moves ever further into a capitalist horizon. Now, anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists, on the other hand, have a very different position on this. They don't view these regimes as socialists anymore, and they consider this kind of general Marxism-Leninism that we described to be revisionist. Anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists tend to be more critical of these actually existing socialist regimes, but for reasons that you probably wouldn't expect. Anti-revisionist MLs often criticize actually existing socialism not because it was too authoritarian, but because it wasn't authoritarian enough. At least not authoritarian enough against the so-called revisionists. Wait, seriously? This must be like some hyperbolic straw man or something. No, I am dead serious. They believe this. Anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists believe that Stalin's crusade against the so-called revisionists was justified, even if there were some excesses along the way. Some anti-revisionist MLs might think that the purges were a little too violent, but often they will outright say, or at least imply, that they should have persecuted more, not less. Those who subscribe to the anti-revisionist line of thinking tend to believe in a very specific grand narrative about Soviet history. Basically, they believe that socialism went to shit after Stalin died. Yep, they view Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech condemning Stalin as the moment when socialism was betrayed and became revisionist. They basically uphold the Stalinist party line and believe that the Soviet Union after Stalin's death became revisionist. This is why many call them Stalinists, but don't call them that, because they hate it, and they don't think Stalinism exists. To make sense of this anti-revisionist position, we need a quick history lesson. Remember those Marxist debates over revisionism that we discussed earlier? What began as an intellectual debate over the proper interpretation of Marx between Kautsky, Bernstein, Rosa Luxemburg, and then Lenin, later turned into a matter of life or death under Stalin. Literally. Being labeled a revisionist in Stalin's Soviet Union now came with a potential death sentence. Critics of Stalin's policies, or those who simply deviated from the party line, were labeled revisionists, which Stalin's cadre used as a justification to purge not just political dissidents in general, but a large portion of the Bolshevik Party's original leadership and membership, who had been there since the beginning of the revolution. And for those who know the history well, who have read historians like J.R. Czekedy, you would know that it wasn't just Stalin himself orchestrating these purges, but many of the local and provincial police forces would use the excuse of revisionism to just purge as many people as possible, often people who they simply had bad blood with or had a beef with. It's kind of like an even more violent statist version of the Cultural Revolution. Having these proletarian police forces at the local and regional levels carry out the purges was also a way for Stalin to exonerate himself and distance himself from the excesses. When it comes to the Stalinist Great Purge, there are many debates as to how high the death counts were. Marxist-Leninists like to spend a great deal of time talking about how the official death counts are very much exaggerated. And to be fair, some anti-communist sources very much do exaggerate the amount of deaths. At the end of the day, by even the most conservative estimates, Stalin's Great Purge killed at least 700,000 people, and from what we can confirm in the Soviet archives, at least 14 million individuals were sent into labor camps. The big irony in all of this is that despite all of the endless purges to supposedly cleanse a society from revisionists and stop revisionists from infiltrating the party and steering the society towards capitalism, the so-called revisionists ended up taking power anyway after Stalin died. Now you might be thinking, what exactly made the post-Stalin USSR revisionist? There are a few key reasons as to why the anti-revisionists believe the Soviet Union went down revisionist road. So after the death of Stalin, behind closed doors, Nikita Khrushchev exposed what many people had been thinking but were too terrified to say out loud. Because when Stalin was alive, everyone was scared shitless to oppose his party line, as they could easily end up dead or in the gulag. In this secret speech, Khrushchev exposed the huge death toll and the massive number of prisoners that had been incarcerated in labor camps under Stalin's rule. He also critiqued Stalin's cult of personality and its consequences, arguing that what was supposed to be a party dictatorship had turned into a personal dictatorship under Stalin. Marxist-Leninists like to refute this by bringing up this CIA document that says that Stalin had collective leadership. However, this has been debunked quite thoroughly. I highly recommend this video by NOJ Rants on it, and all his videos in general are pretty decent. Also, just please read a history book. I recommend The Soviet Century by Moshe Lewin. It's very long and in-depth, and goes over just exactly how Stalin exerted so much power and was able to control virtually all the security apparatus and use it against his political opponents. It's also very critical of the USSR after Stalin, too. Under Khrushchev, the party launched the de-Stalinization campaign to liberalize party debate and loosen up party control just a little bit. Many scholars have argued that this is when the USSR became less totalitarian, at least compared to how it was under Stalin. So as you already know, the doctrine of Marxism-Leninism was first formally coined by Joseph Stalin. After Stalin's death, a major split emerged in Marxism-Leninism between a revisionist and an anti-revisionist camp. Now, aside from condemning their beloved Stalin, anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists generally point to a few other revisionist developments that supposedly started with Khrushchev. First is Khrushchev's attempt at peaceful coexistence with the West, after nearly coming to nuclear war with the United States over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anti-revisionists saw this as abandoning international class struggle. Second, the anti-revisionists pointed to the introduction of market mechanisms under Khrushchev as well as certain aspects of decentralization, which they saw as steps towards capitalist restoration. Third, anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists critiqued Khrushchev's replacement of the dictatorship of the proletariat with the vaguer category of the state of the whole people, which they saw as effectively declaring class struggle over within the USSR. The funny thing about this, though, is that Stalin himself had already laid the foundation for this revisionist turn in 1936 by claiming that all exploiting classes were abolished, and that the USSR was entering the lower phase of communism, which is something that Mao Zedong would later criticize. It is important to note that the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist narrative about the Soviet Union going down revisionist road ever since Khrushchev was first popularized during the Sino-Soviet split by Mao Zedong and Enver Hoxha, who, funny enough, would later end up falling out and calling each other revisionists as well.
Hello there, Maoist. How are you doing?
How's it going, Leninist? Do any good revisionism today?
Revisionist? You're the revisionist here.
No, you're a revisionist.
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 Guys,
Guys, settle down. Enough of this pointless infighting. I think we can all agree that you're both revisionists.
Okay, this guy is clearly the most revisionist.
Was all this commie infighting over ideological purity? Or were anti-revisionist talking points merely a rhetorical ploy to mask the realpolitik of geopolitical power plays between competing neighboring states? Keep in mind that it wasn't just these self-professed anti-revisionists who criticized Khrushchev. Why do you think that other members of the CPC like Deng Xiaoping also denounced Khrushchev's de-Stalinization? Mind you, that Deng Xiaoping was one of the people who Mao accused of being a revisionist from the very beginning. So was the condemnation of Khrushchev really just about revisionism? Of course not. If you look closely at the debates, it's clear that the main problem that they had with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign was first and foremost that it undermined the legitimacy of the Communist Party by exposing the atrocities that had occurred under Stalin. Admitting these mistakes had a ripple effect around all of the communist world, as the legitimacy of the ruling communist parties, which were now effectively the new ruling classes, was now under threat. This is precisely what the Communist Party of China and Enver Hoxha were saying when they blamed Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign for the Hungarian Revolt of 1956, because they believe Khrushchev sowed the seeds for anti-communist activities. Still to this day, Marxist-Leninists like to claim that the Hungarian Revolt was just a CIA-backed counter-revolution. And don't get me started on these arguments, because they're just as silly as the far-right arguments that Antifa exists because of George Soros or something. You can't just psyop that many people into revolting against the government unless they have a legitimate reason to do so. What anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists dislike most about Khrushchev, and you can find this sort of sentiment with Marxist-Leninists in general, is that he essentially destabilized the party's grip on power by liberalizing control and allowing for more dissent. Whereas Khrushchev straight up exposed many of the Soviet state's crimes under Stalin, Leonid Brezhnev took a more cautious don't ask, don't tell approach, neither rehabilitating Stalin nor continuing de-Stalinization. They kind of just banked on everybody forgetting about what happened. Brezhnev's policy of developed socialism effectively put Soviet ideological evolution on hold, creating temporary stability but leaving a vacuum that would eventually come to undermine the system's legitimacy. Watching these developments closely, the Communist Party of China would choose a much more sophisticated strategy. Deng Xiaoping understood that if you are not going to legitimize your rule through elections, then the party state has to preserve its revolutionary mythology in order to maintain its legitimacy. So after Mao's death, instead of flat-out condemning Mao, the CPC symbolically upheld Mao's legacy, while dismantling all his policies. Deng Xiaoping used the 70% good, 30% bad formula to give a final verdict to Mao's legacy. This genius sleight of hand performed extraordinary ideological work. The result was socialism with Chinese characteristics, arguably history's most successful ideological finesse ever seen, where capitalist mechanisms could generate wealth while the illusion of Marxist-Leninist mythology maintained the party's unquestioned political dominance. Now, this realist lens of seeing ideology as a tool to legitimize power is generally what most Marxist-Leninists just won't tell you when they try to explain these things. They will be perfectly capable of seeing how spreading freedom and democracy is often used as a veil to legitimize American and British imperialism. Yet they won't consider how Marxist communism can also be used to legitimize a new ruling class. But instead, they take the official party propaganda at face value. Though unlike the general MLs, the ever-dying breed of anti-revisionist MLs will at least somewhat agree with this, as they do not consider modern-day China or really any of the Marxist-Leninist regimes to be socialist, but rather revisionists. However, what the anti-revisionists also fail to acknowledge is that from the very beginning, with its coinage under Stalin, Marxism-Leninism was always a state ideology aimed at legitimizing the party's permanent grip on power, with socialist construction being a means of legitimizing state control, and categories like revisionists being used by different politicians to legitimize their authority while justifying the persecution of their political rivals. Because the Communist Party was the only legitimate party allowed to rule, power struggles within it were always framed within Marxist language, because they had to use Marxist theory to always justify whatever they were doing, instead of just carrying out their power struggles in a more transparent civil manner like in a multi-party democracy, like how different competing capitalist parties disagree with each other on various issues. During and after Stalin, Marxist language games ultimately served as rhetorical weapons for legitimizing power, by framing power struggles under the veneer of communist ideological purity. Stalin infamously invoked the notion of class struggle to justify his purges of political rivals and those who went against his party line, on the flimsy basis that his victims harbored bourgeois ideology. So therefore, getting rid of them was like getting rid of enemies of the proletariat. Stalin would also use the pretext of building socialism and class struggle to justify his forced collectivization policies, in which state ownership became synonymous with socialism. The term kulak, which originally referred to relatively wealthier farmers, was stretched and exaggerated to describe peasants in general who just didn't want to involuntarily give up all their produce to the state. They became a huge scapegoat in order for the Soviet government to justify the forced collectivization policy, which was essentially a geopolitical policy to bolster up the Soviet military in preparation for a potential war with Britain and Nazi Germany. Yes, at the time under Stalin's rule, they actually thought that the British were a bigger threat than the Nazis were. Yet the crucial thing to note here is that this policy was legitimized by the Soviet government by essentially calling state control socialism, because it's pretty hard to justify just collectivizing everything at gunpoint and giving it to the state. So you have to call it socialism in order to make it legitimate. And in doing so, Stalin essentially ruined an entire generation of Marxism by having socialism be associated with state control. More on that in another video. Then, after Stalin, Khrushchev employed the state of the whole people rhetoric to end the purges while allowing the bureaucracy to maintain its power as the new ruling class. Now, despite its general resurgence and its massive popularity online, general Marxism-Leninism is rarely at all used as a doctrine for building revolutionary politics. Today, the only groups trying to take socialist revolution seriously are really just the Maoists and different varieties of libertarian socialists. Before we talk about Maoism, we gotta address the elephant in the room. One of the most contentious and highly misunderstood terms in communist discourse: Stalinism. Stalinism is a quite spicy term in Marxist-Leninist circles. Most people outside of the communist world have an intuitive sense as to what Stalinism is, but when it comes to actually pinning it down and what exactly it means, there are many different disagreements. And because people throw around the term in such a vague way, it causes Marxist-Leninists to often dismiss the term altogether, claiming it's not really a thing. Many of the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists will often tell you that Stalinism isn't really a thing. They'll just say it's Marxism-Leninism, and that the whole idea of Stalinism is a anti-communist and Trotskyist conspiracy. It's a buzzword that doesn't really mean anything. The irony, of course, is that the people who are most likely to tell you that Stalinism isn't a thing are themselves Stalinists. Now, who aside from Stalin himself counts as a Stalinist? Well, if you Google search, you will see names like Mao Zedong, Nicolae Ceausescu, Enver Hoxha, and even Kim Il-sung. The reason why these specific figures get mentioned as Stalinists has more to do with their totalitarian forms of rule. However, this alone does not make any of these figures Stalinist. Now, Trotskyists, on the other hand, tend to use the term Stalinism a lot more broadly. Trotskyists will define Stalinism as trying to secure socialism in one country and abandoning the international revolution. They use the term to describe not just the USSR under Stalin, but just about all of the actually existing socialist or state socialist experiments, including Cuba, Vietnam, and even modern China. But I don't think this definition is very accurate. Stalinism could more accurately be defined as the doctrine, practices, and political narratives associated with Joseph Stalin and the people who bought into them after his death. Stalinism is broadly characterized by its emphasis on centralized control, rapid industrialization, forced collectivization of agriculture, and mass political repression. One of the hallmarks of Stalinism is its embrace of totalitarian rule, with a zero-tolerance approach to dissent, mass violent purges of party members, and the use of secret police to totally eliminate dissent. Now, given the de-Stalinization campaign, it's quite evident that Khrushchev and many of the Soviet leaders after Stalin's death couldn't really be described as Stalinists. After all, the de-Stalinization campaign is precisely why all the die-hard Stalinists hate Khrushchev so much, and why they call much of the Soviet states after Stalin revisionist. This is why the Trotskyist habit of calling all Marxist-Leninist regimes and leaders Stalinist is not really accurate at all. It is precisely this incoherent use of the term that allows MLs to dismiss the term altogether, and not take the criticism seriously. The USSR post-Stalin, Cuba under Castro, Tito's Yugoslavia, none of them are Stalinists. Stalinists consider them revisionists, meaning that they would fall under the more general Marxism-Leninism category. Those who could be described as Stalinists in a meaningful sense are those who believe and uphold Stalin's anti-revisionist line of thinking, and the anti-revisionist conception of history that we described earlier. There are also a few distinctive characteristics of Stalinists if you want to spot one in the wild, such as people who defend the Great Purges and the show trials as necessary, those who believe that Stalin's anti-revisionist purges were actually purges of revisionists and not just power struggles, people who think that everything went to shit after Stalin died and blame Khrushchev for taking the USSR off the socialist path, those who implicitly or explicitly think that the Soviet Union could have been saved if they just purged more revisionists. Oh, and Stalinists these days often just straight up have a Stalin avatar in their profile picture. Stalinists also have a weird obsession with Trotskyists and assume that anyone who does not buy into their narratives is either a liberal or a Trot, nickname for Trotskyist. So then you might be thinking, who is a Stalinist? Which notable leaders are Stalinists aside from Stalin himself and his loyalists? Now, out of all the communist leaders, the one who could safely be described as a Stalinist, in fact, the defining Stalinist, is a man named Enver Hoxha, leader of communist Albania. Hoxhaism. It's called Hoxhaism because it's named after Enver Hoxha, the leader of communist Albania from 1944 up until his death in 1985. Hoxhaism is known for being the most intensely anti-revisionist variant of Marxism-Leninism, and by anti-revisionist, this really means Stalinist. If there was any man who represented the ideology of Stalin outside of Stalin himself and his sycophants, it would be Enver Hoxha. I mean, Hoxhaism is kind of like high Stalinism. It's so Stalinist that he didn't even think that other Stalinists were Stalinist enough. Enver Hoxha viewed Comrade Stalin as the last true Marxist-Leninist leader, and believed that after he died, the Soviet Union and many communist parties around the world deviated from true Marxism-Leninism. Hoxha fiercely defended Stalin's legacy and rejected Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policy. Hoxha opposed what he deemed as any revisions to classical Marxist-Leninist principles. It's a strict adherence to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy and resistance to anything that smells slightly like revisionism or capitalism. Hoxha accused both Tito's Yugoslavia and the USSR under Khrushchev of being revisionist, for deviating from true Marxist-Leninist principles, by which he really meant deviation from Stalin's line. Hoxhaism only emerged as an actual ideology that people believed in outside of Albania after the Sino-Soviet split in the 1970s. At the time, Mao Zedong actually agreed with Hoxha's critique of the USSR for being revisionist. But then Hoxha ironically also accused China of being revisionist. Everybody was a revisionist and was distorting Marxism, except, you guessed it, Stalin. I mean, Enver Hoxha really likes Stalin. I mean, he's the most Stalinist who isn't Stalin himself. After denouncing the Soviet Union and China as traitors to the communist cause, Hoxha turned Albania into what was essentially a communist hermit kingdom, pursuing an aggressive policy of self-reliance that basically made Albania into one of the most, if not the most, isolated state in the world. Basically the North Korea of Eastern Europe. Though Romania under the rule of Ceausescu comes as a close runner-up for that title. As leader of Albania, Hoxha took Stalin's model and pushed it to insane extremes. Hoxha called for total state control of all sectors of the economy and militant atheism, launching what was arguably history's most militant atheist campaign of all time, officially banning religion and shutting down virtually every single house of worship. He actually declared Albania to be the world's first officially atheist state, and he also launched an obsessive resistance to any form of ideological corruption from the Western world. Hoxha was basically a mix of the most insane ideological fanaticism paired with an insane thirst for power. While Hoxha claimed to be preserving authentic Marxism-Leninism to the obsessive point of psychosis, what he really created in Albania was more akin to a bunker state frozen in a 1950s Stalinist time capsule. A demented psychotic experiment in ideological absolutism that left Albania economically impoverished and politically isolated. Although Hoxha's influence today does not really extend much beyond the weird schizospheres of the internet, it was surprisingly once a big ideological influence for a few anti-revisionist communist parties around the world, who were disillusioned with both China and the USSR. Fun fact, one of the Communist parties of Canada at a certain point in time actually adhered to Hoxhaism. However, the parties who adhere to Hoxha's thoughts usually remain very fringe because they came across as a bunch of crazy psychos. Overall, Enver Hoxha's Albania remains a horrifying case study in how the quest for ideological purity can lead down some very strange paths. Now, the truth is that Hoxhaism and the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists more generally are really a dying breed. Those who still insist on the anti-revisionist way have since moved into the Maoist camp. I think it's safe to say that the majority of Marxist-Leninists today more so fall under the general Marxist-Leninist camp. Now, despite all their differences, general Marxist-Leninists, anti-revisionists, Maoists, Hoxhists, all of them tend to get lumped together as part of this group called Tankies, a rather controversial term in the leftist ecosystem. But what does it mean? The term tanky originally started as a pejorative to describe the communist hardliners who defended the Soviet Union's decision to send tanks to crush the mass protests in Hungary of 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, known as the Prague Spring. Hence the term tanky, which was originally aimed at members of the Communist Party of Great Britain who would defend literally any Soviet action as anti-imperialist. But the Tankies of today are less defined by their love of Soviet tanks, although they do love Chinese tanks, and more by their particular brand of online leftism. Over time, the word tanky broadened to encompass virtually everyone who uncritically supports all quote-unquote authoritarian socialist regimes, from the USSR to contemporary China to North Korea. Tanky tends to describe a certain personality who will defend all of the atrocities of these regimes and dismiss most criticisms of them as Western propaganda. Today's day and age, the word tanky has sort of become like the word fascist. People throw it around very loosely with little regard as to what it really means. It's often used as a lazy insult to delegitimize communist viewpoints, often by liberals and also by anarchists. But when the word is used sparingly, it also points to a serious, substantial critique. Today's so-called tankies tend to champion whatever regime calls themselves socialists, and in some cases, they just worship whatever regime they think is anti-American, even the non-communist ones, like Putin's Russia or the Assadist dictatorship in Syria, which doesn't exist anymore. This uncritical defense of virtually any regime that calls itself socialist or one that just merely claims to oppose Western hegemony is why tankies are sometimes described as regime enjoyers. They see themselves as red-pilled truth-tellers reacting against the exaggerated Western propaganda that is created to demonize the rivals of American imperialism, whether it be China, Russia, or any other targets like North Korea or Cuba. And to be fair, many of their critiques of US imperialism often have merit. Were the anti-war activists who opposed the Vietnam War tankies? Were the people who protested the Iraq War tankies? How about the people who defend Cuba against the US embargo, which still exists to this very day? One can be opposed to US imperialism without resorting to the sort of Marxist-Leninist quote-unquote tanky narratives that you see. Now, some people like to use the case study of tankies to equate far-left and far-right authoritarianism, but I think there's one thing that those who make a big fuss out of tankies miss. The way I see it is that most of the time, much of these so-called tankies often just become mascots for foreign regimes because they want something to believe in. And in a time without very much to hope for, who can blame them? Tanky is a word that can be used to describe more of a mentality or an aesthetic rather than a coherent political ideology. I think their regime cheerleading is more reflective of their nihilism more than anything, which is why I personally don't really consider the tankies to be a serious threat in the same way that the far right is a threat. But tankies really don't do much favors for the reputation of socialism. There is a Cold War anti-communist perspective that sees Marxism itself as a totalitarian ideology. Anti-communists will often point to these examples of Marxist-Leninist states as a way to dismiss the question of socialism as a whole, and any criticisms of capitalism. Most serious Marxists refute this claim, and in doing so try to distance themselves from the legacy of the Marxist-Leninist regimes. Instead of pointing to the fact that the ideas that Marx envisioned are totally at odds with Marxism-Leninism, and that there are various kinds of socialisms, the Marxist-Leninist response to the anti-communist propaganda is just to flip it on its head and say, no, they were good, actually. In a way, it's sort of like the mirror of the anti-communist narrative. The anti-communist propaganda is that socialism must be authoritarian in order to work. The Marxist-Leninist response is to say, yes, actually. Of course, they won't really ever admit that these states were authoritarianism because they reject the label itself. What they will do is make a sort of whataboutism argument to dismiss the question of authoritarianism entirely. They'll say, well, what about all the authoritarian activities of the United States and Western imperialism? What about all the dictatorships that the Americans propped up? Doesn't that make them hypocrites? And of course it does. But the Marxist-Leninists take this to a very odd conclusion, basically saying that, well, they do it too, so therefore authoritarianism is a meaningless category. All states are authoritarian. What matters is the class interest that the state is protecting, and who is in charge. And this sort of thinking gives me very little confidence that Marxist-Leninists would be any better at running a regime this time around if they ever got the chance. Now, to be fair, there are some variants of Marxism-Leninism who are far more critical of past socialist regimes, not just the Stalinists we discussed earlier. There have been offshoots of Marxism-Leninism that have sought to go beyond it, and add some very new things to it, transforming it into a new ideology altogether. This brings us to Maoism, or Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, as some advocates call it, what they think of as the highest, most advanced evolution of Marxism-Leninism. To So let's clear up one major misconception when it comes to Maoism. Maoism is not an ideology invented by Mao himself. If you ever met a dedicated Maoist online, they'll be quick to emphasize to you the distinction between Mao Zedong thought on the one hand and Maoism on the other hand. And it might seem like splitting hairs over semantics, but these things are not the same. Trust me, the Maoists will make you do a struggle session over this. You'll be wearing a dunce cap in no time. While the seeds of what would become Maoism, of course, have their roots in Mao Zedong himself, Maoism is a separate ideology, and it wasn't invented until later after his death. So then, what's the difference between Maoism and Mao Zedong thought? Mao Zedong thought is the original framework crafted by Mao Zedong himself and his crew in the Communist Party of China. This Mao Zedong thought would seem to add some new things to the existing established ideology of official Marxism-Leninism. The ideas and practices that made up Mao Zedong thought were developed from as early as the 1920s up until Mao's death, and they were largely constructed in response to China's unique conditions, tailored to guide the Chinese Revolution.
Mao looked at Marx and Lenin's ideas and said, cool. But this whole industrial working class thing, yeah, it's not going to work in China.
After all, 80% of China at the time was peasants. Mao totally flipped the script. He made the peasants the main revolutionary force, not just the proletariat, as Marx originally envisioned. But Mao would go on to make a bunch of important contributions to Marxist politics. Let's briefly go over some of Mao's major contributions to political Marxism. The strategy of protracted people's war is one of Mao Zedong's most important contributions, not just to Marxism, but to the concept of guerrilla warfare in general. I mean, for a while, Mao Zedong was actually even studied by US military generals. For Mao, the basic idea of protracted people's war was a revolution starting in rural areas where guerrilla warfare was to be used gradually to weaken the enemy, while the revolution then would spread across urban areas. The strategy reflects the importance of peasants as the revolutionary base in agrarian societies like China, which is why it would go on to influence Vietnam and Cuba. Mao came up with the strategy very early during the Chinese Civil War, back when the communists were losing to the Kuomintang, the KMT, in the cities. The communists still insisted that the proletariat was the true and only revolutionary subject. But Mao went against this consensus by pointing out that nobody was giving a shit about the peasants in the countryside. So the party took a leap of faith and went with Mao's decision. They retreated to the countryside and slowly built ties with the rural communities. This would become part of what is known as the Long March, probably one of the most impressive, colossal feats accomplished by the Chinese Communist Party. The fact that Mao Zedong turned out to be right in this decision relative to the rest of his party members gave him godlike status within the party, and it's part of why a cult of personality developed around him. While Marxists traditionally viewed peasants as backward and lacking in revolutionary potential, Mao thought otherwise. He saw them as blank slates, unlike the urban proletariat in the big cities who he believed was more susceptible to bourgeois propaganda. And when you look at how absolutely terrible the relationship was between the Bolshevik government under Stalin and the peasantry, you can see why many were skeptical of this strategy of reaching out to the peasants. But turns out it worked. The mass line is a form of leadership that basically involved listening to the masses, borrowing their ideas, synthesizing their ideas with what the party deemed to be the correct ideas, and then packaging those ideas into a policy program that aligns with the revolutionary goals of the party, in a way that appeals to the masses. Basically, Mao was just telling the party to touch grass. But speaking of grass, if only Mao didn't shoot the damn sparrows for pooping on the grass. Maybe then millions of people wouldn't have starved to death in the Great Leap Forward. Oh well. Now, what is always quite interesting to me about this idea of the mass line in Maoism is that it's positioned as this profound idea, but I would think that this ought to be like standard practice for any political party that wants to represent the people. I mean, it's basically just paying attention and talking to people, not being out of touch in your own bubble. It's like you don't have to be a Maoist to accept why that's a good idea. Now, see, even though a lot of people did die under Mao and Stalin, these two figures were a lot more different than people realize, which is part of why I did not include Mao Zedong thought under the Stalinist category that we described earlier. Many do consider Mao to be a Stalinist, and that Maoism is synonymous with Stalinism. Mao was actually quite critical of Stalin, and this isn't immediately obvious to people who don't read what he wrote carefully. Although both Mao and Stalin had an obsession with opposing revisionism and often used class struggle as an excuse to silence those who disagreed with them, there were some stark differences between how they approached these things. I mean, for starters, the purges under Mao were just simply way less violent than they were under Stalin. Whereas the targets of Stalin's purges would usually end up dead or in the brutal gulags in Siberia, Mao, at least when compared to Stalin, preferred to purge his opponents in less violent ways. His preferred method of political purging was to send people to go work with the peasants, a phrase that I just find really funny. It's a really euphemistic way to go about purging somebody, you know? It's like a friendly gulag. It's like, just go work with the peasants. Just go, get some experience, man. Don't be a little bitch. But the most significant difference between Mao and Stalin was Mao's criticism of bureaucratization. Mao was actually highly concerned with the Communist Party becoming a bureaucratic elite that would rule in its own interests at the expense of the masses, and possibly even restore capitalism. Oh, who would have thought that? But no, there's no China. There's no capitalism in China. What are you talking about? The people's billionaires, bruh. Mao's solution to this bureaucratization problem was, of course, the Cultural Revolution, a campaign to purge counter-revolutionaries and mobilize the youth to scare the living shit out of the party and guard against corruption and so-called bourgeois elements and rightist deviations, ostensibly to ensure that China would remain on the course towards communism. Mao's emphasis on continuous revolution meant to emphasize that class struggle doesn't end even when socialism is achieved. By this, he particularly meant the establishment of a socialist regime, and his main target of this critique was the Soviet Communist Party itself and the Chinese Communist Party. If you want to learn more on how the Cultural Revolution went down, I have a whole video on that. It's one of my proudest works. You can go check that out. So the contributions of Mao Zedong thought were explicitly baked into the constitution of the Communist Party of China and became part of its guiding philosophy, at least on paper. But as we know, Mao would end up having steep ideological disagreements with his party, especially in the lead-up to the infamous Cultural Revolution. Of course, China would end up taking a completely different path altogether after Mao died and the Gang of Four was prosecuted. Now remember, Mao Zedong thought it was supposed to be something quite specific to the Chinese geopolitical conditions. It wasn't designed to be a global blueprint for revolution. Even when Mao himself was asked by some of his followers abroad as to whether his ideas could be applied in their countries, he was basically like, well, here's what worked for us, good luck figuring your own thing. But some commies outside of China were inspired by Mao's ideas, were like, hold my little red book, and would run around calling themselves Maoists, mostly in third world agrarian countries like India, Yemen, Nepal, but also in countries like France and the United States. Actually, when the Sino-Soviet split happened, a lot of anti-revisionist MLs became Maoists. And that's why you had a bunch of Maoism in France and the United States, even though they had completely different material conditions. Maoism was a way of being a Marxist-Leninist, but like a real Marxist-Leninist, and supporting the real revolution in China, unlike the revisionist Soviet Union. But there were a lot of people outside of China who didn't call themselves Maoists, but were heavily inspired by Mao Zedong thought, such as the Black Panther Party, who were heavily inspired by Mao's ideas, particularly the mass line. Now, Maoists will insist that Maoism was not formed into a concrete doctrine of its own during Mao's lifetime. But when exactly Maoism did become a distinct ideology is up for a considerable debate. Some say that Maoism was first formed in India with the Naxalite movement. But for now, it's safe to say that according to most Maoists today, Maoism was not formed into a distinct, coherent ideology until the creation of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism in Peru by this wacky philosophy professor known as Chairman Gonzalo. Oh, we'll get to the Gonzaloites, don't you worry. Today, many Maoists refer to their ideology as Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, MLM for short. And I know what you might be thinking. It's not called MLM because it's a multi-level marketing scheme. Despite all the cult-like tendencies within Maoist organizations, they really aren't all that good at marketing. Seriously though, get a better acronym, guys. Today's Maoists include everything from real tough communist guerrilla fighters in the Philippines and in India, all the way to just edgy Starbucks communists on Twitter talking about revolution in a first world country in which the context is so not suited for Maoism. But to give credit where credit's due, Maoism has manifested in various real world movements. You got the Naxalites in India, the Maoist guerrilla movement in Nepal, the Shining Path of Peru, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the Maoist guerrilla movement in the Philippines, which still actually is surprisingly quite a significant force to this very day. Maoism could be considered near the ultra-left spectrum, although Maoists usually won't consider themselves as ultra-left. For them, the people who are ultra-left are anarchists. But in general, you could say the anti-revisionists are definitely more on the ultra-left side compared to the general Marxist-Leninists who are okay with capitalistic reforms. But it's worth noting that some Maoist strands are more extreme than others. Yep, even within f***ing Maoism, there are different variants. And there are some pretty serious variants as well. On the more moderate end, moderate for Maoist standards, you have groups like the Philippines New People's Army, which operates on MLM principles and advocates for land reform and new democracy. They justify their guerrilla warfare tactics against the Filipino government on the basis that the government is not democratic. And to be fair, that's pretty true. The Philippines is basically an oligarchy governed by rival dynasties. Now, on the more extreme end of MLM, you have those who adhere to the kind of Maoism that came out of Peru, known as Gonzalo thought. Gonzalo thought might be one of the most extreme variants of Marxism of all time. So extreme that even many Maoists actually disavow it. But many don't. If you want to know what kind of Maoists you're talking to, just ask them their opinion on the Shining Path of Peru, and it will reveal everything. Those who adhere to Gonzalo thought claim that Marxism-Leninism-Maoism was first invented in Peru by Chairman Gonzalo, who was considered to be a crazy murderous cult leader. But he is also the man credited for, quote-unquote, synthesizing Maoism into a concretely distinct ideological framework, in which he combined Mao Zedong thought with his own Gonzalo thought, into an all-encompassing ideology, which he deemed to be the highest stage of Marxism. This whole thing started when Chairman Gonzalo was a philosophy professor and had control over the entire department. Him and a bunch of his grad students would go on to found the Peruvian Communist Party, what would come to be known as the Shining Path. The Shining Path took Mao's most militant aspects and cranked them up to 11. The reason why MLMs tend to find this very significant is because while most leftist movements around the world at this time were moving away from armed struggle, because keep in mind this is the 1980s, the Soviet Union is largely seen as not a revolutionary state, neither is China. And most communist parties in Europe are basically reformist now. Meanwhile, you got the Maoist Peruvian Communist Party under Gonzalo basically doubling down on revolutionary violence. And that's why the MLMs think this was such a big deal. But others are quite horrified by the shit that went down during this time. For example, Gonzalo promoted concepts like the blood quota, the idea that revolution requires the willingness to sacrifice lives, including those of party members. And you could say this is just a concept of protracted people's war, but many also say that this is like Maoism, but a death cult. And cult in a very literal sense, because there was such a cult of personality around Chairman Gonzalo that it would make even Stalin blush. Although it started as a bunch of grad students, Gonzalo was actually able to recruit a fair amount of workers and quite a few disenchanted indigenous peasants into his army. Although the party would later end up alienating a lot of indigenous people after unleashing some horrific massacres of civilians in villages as part of a terrorism tactic in response to some of their own members getting killed. Many Maoists nevertheless defend the Shining Path because they waged a very significant people's war against the government of Peru, against the far-right Fujimori dictatorship. Well, what they often don't tell you is that this protracted people's war launched by the Shining Path was first launched against the Social Democratic government. Yes, it was first launched against a moderate SOCDEM government, creating a huge climate of chaos that allowed the Fujimori government to take power, on the mandate of putting an end to the chaos and restoring order. And to be fair, I guess, the Maoist guerrilla fighters did put up quite a fight. But the whole movement died quite fast once the leader Chairman Gonzalo was captured and put in prison for life.
While the type of Maoism developed by Gonzalo was formed in the very particular conditions of Peru and had quite mixed results to say the least, followers of Gonzalo thought try to universalize the principles of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. Within Maoism, there are major splits between those who adhere to Gonzalo thought and those who do not, as the legacy of the Shining Path was not the best, to say the least. The Gonzaloites really like to emphasize what was, quote-unquote, accomplished in the Peruvian Civil War, like the fact that they were able to wage a people's war in both rural and urban areas. And they point to that to present Marxism-Leninism-Maoism as universal principles for revolution everywhere. The Gonzaloites mostly exist in the shadow realm online, but every now and then you find them in real life doing the most deranged shit imaginable. They are the people who will debate you endlessly on Twitter about whether Gonzalo's gang really did boil babies alive or not. Now overall, despite all of their differences, there are a few key ideas that all Maoists today generally agree are central to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, like the need for continual cultural revolutions to combat revisionism. Maoism takes the idea of fighting counter-revolutionaries and says, yeah, never stop. Revolution all the time. But most of all, the Marxist-Leninist-Maoists tend to agree on the universality of the protracted People's War as the revolutionary strategy. Not just for third world countries with a large peasant population, most of them came to the conclusion looking at China and Peru and being like, you know what, this could work anywhere. Put simply, MLMs try to turn Mao Zedong thought into a universal doctrine that can theoretically be applied anywhere, even to first world countries in the global north. That's why you can still find some Maoists here and there all over the place, even in the United States, and apparently even in f***ing Norway. Yeah, I don't know how they think that's gonna work. Because if it hasn't happened already in any first world country, how the hell is it gonna work in a country where people actually have it pretty good? I mean, like, the Norwegians get oil money from the government. Why would they want to join a people's war? However, Maoists often disagree on this very particular point, as some believe that MLM is a universal doctrine that can be applied anywhere, while others believe that the global north is too far gone. And by too far gone, they really mean that the first world is too rich to revolt. This brings us to another strand of Marxism, Third-Worldism. Is Third-Worldism just Marxism in the Third World? Not quite. Marxist Third-Worldism, typically, although not always, an offshoot of Maoism, might be one of the most controversial tendencies in radical Marxist politics. Third-Worldism basically turns classical Marxism on its head. While Marx himself thought that the revolution was going to happen in the advanced capitalist countries due to having the most advanced proletariat, Third-Worldists argue that workers in places like Europe and America have been thoroughly bought off by the spoils of imperialism. This perspective evolved partly from Mao Zedong's three worlds theory, which divided the globe into three camps. The first world imperialist countries, like those in Europe, the United States, Japan, and then the Soviet Union, being kind of the second world, which were advanced, but as Mao believed were becoming socially imperialist. And then you got the third world, mainly the global south, which was exploited by the first world. While Mao's theory was more about geopolitical strategy than revolutionary theory, Third Worldists took this framework and ran with it, developing a more radical analysis that drew heavily from Lenin's concept of the labor aristocracy. The Third Worldists claim that the relative comforts enjoyed by Western workers as a whole, from higher wages to social benefits, are directly funded by the brutal exploitation of the global south, making first world workers complicit beneficiaries rather than revolutionary subjects. The Third Worldists view the whole world as divided between exploiter and exploited nations, arguing that the underdevelopment of the global south isn't just a phase but a permanent condition that is actively maintained by imperialism. It's not workers of the world unite, but rather the oppressed countries unite against the imperialist world, because the Third Worldists basically give up on the revolutionary potential of the working class in the first world, being that the real revolutionary potential lies not with organized labor movements in the developed countries, but rather in the struggles of peasants and workers in the global south, who face the most direct and brutal forms forms of capitalist exploitation. Critics of Third Worldism argue that it promotes a kind of nihilism. If first world workers are hopelessly corrupted by the privileges that they supposedly get from imperialism, then what's the point of organizing them at all? This kind of third world analysis often leads to a particular form of paralysis, where third worldists spend more time dismissing other leftists as social imperialists instead of actually doing political work. They also have this tendency to heavily romanticize and even fetishize third world struggles while ignoring the complex realities and internal class contradictions within these developing nations themselves. Now, a lot of the time, communists of various sorts appeal to third worldist arguments without being explicit third worldists. For example, they often appeal to third worldist arguments to discredit the success of other left-wing politics, namely social democracy, particularly Nordic social democracy. Many Marxist-Leninists use third worldist arguments to claim that the only reason why Nordic social democracy succeeded at all is because they exploit the global south and benefit from imperialism. Now, the problem is that these third worldist arguments take half-truths and take them to radical conclusions that have no basis in reality. And yes, sure, some Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden, like other capitalist countries, have big companies, like IKEA, that do indeed exploit third world labor. But the third worldist Marxists like to act as if the Nordic welfare states are somehow being funded by wheelbarrows of wealth extracted from the global south, and this just simply isn't true. It's really just propaganda to convince people that social democracy isn't a viable option, and that Marxist-Leninist revolution is the only path forward. The only real way in which these Scandinavian social democracies benefited from imperialism in a way that the communist regimes didn't is by getting access to the cheap goods traded on the world market, like fruits and certain raw materials that only global south countries can produce in abundance. But by this logic, modern communist China also benefits from imperialism by importing cheap goods produced by countries with cheap labor. Not to mention the fact that China played a major role in participating in this imperialism itself by super exploiting its own labor force and selling goods to the West. Where do you think all that foreign direct investment came from? It came from Western capitalist countries to exploit Chinese workers. What do you call that? And yet, many Marxist-Leninists still consider China to be a socialist country. And to be fair to many of the Third Worldist Maoist camp, they are at least consistent in their beliefs and do not think that China is a socialist country, but rather a revisionist capitalist state. Those who hold this position, namely the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists and the Maoists, tend to call the Marxist-Leninists who uphold modern China as a socialist country Dengists. If you've been around communist spaces online, you have probably heard this word being thrown around before. Dengism is a term that Marxists often use as an insult to describe general Marxist-Leninists. It tends to be used most by the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists, namely the Maoists. For this reason, I could have easily put Dengism under the category of general Marxism-Leninism, but I don't really like this term, so it's why I want to address it. I think Dengism describes something way more specific and isn't an accurate term to describe general Marxism-Leninism, even though it's often used as a synonym for it. Dengism refers to the political and economic path that China took after Mao Zedong's death, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Although Deng and the party still claim to be adhering to the canon of Marxism-Leninism, Dengism diverged sharply from Mao's approach of continuous class struggle and communist ideological purity. Instead, Deng prioritized pragmatic reforms that prioritize stability and the development of China's productive forces. The essence of the pragmatic Dengist outlook could be summed up in Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase, quote,
"It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice."
Capitalism, socialism, communism, call it whatever you want, as long as it benefits China. That was Deng Xiaoping's mentality. Deng oversaw reforms like the Four Modernizations, which opened China up to foreign investment, allowed for private enterprise, and decentralized decision-making in agriculture and industry. Up until his death, Mao Zedong was continuously trying to combat what he saw as bourgeois elements within the bureaucracy, and distrusted any strata within the party that he thought could become the new bourgeoisie, which included technocrats, managers, skilled professionals, and most of all, the party cadre. In contrast to Mao, Deng Xiaoping was a big fan of technocrats, and thought that if China was to grow economically and that some people would become rich as a result of it, then so be it. What matters most is that China gets richer as a whole. Reforms in China would end up lifting millions out of poverty. However, spooked by the ghosts of the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party would no longer tolerate any challenges to its authority. So while China liberalized economically, it didn't quite liberalize politically. Ever since Deng Xiaoping's transformation, the system of the People's Republic of China has been characterized as socialism with Chinese characteristics, a description which has been upheld by the leaders of the CPC from Deng all the way to Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping. Central to socialism with Chinese characteristics is the idea of the socialist market economy, which basically involves a combination of calculated market reforms that boost economic prosperity under the strict planning and supervision of the state, which still maintains a lot of public ownership and tries to ensure that the foreign direct investment that pours into China as a result of the reforms is done in such a way that benefits China as a whole. According to Maoists and various other anti-revisionist Marxists, Deng Xiaoping's market reforms are when China abandoned the road to socialism and became capitalist, whereas the Dengist position is that these reforms were in fact part of the road to socialism, as they were necessary to blend socialism with market-oriented reforms so that China could become wealthy enough to become a prosperous communist society at some point, whenever the fuck that will be. And as we mentioned before, this is the general Marxist-Leninist position, because they define socialism as the transitionary state itself, not a new mode of society. This socialism is marked by what is essentially faith in the Chinese Communist Party's claim to be transitioning to socialism. Titoism refers to the political and economic system implemented by Josip Broz Tito, leader of Socialist Yugoslavia. Socialist Yugoslavia had a radically unique system that was very different from the other so-called communist regimes. Although Tito claimed to be a Marxist-Leninist and was labeled a revisionist by other Marxist leaders like Stalin, he had a different interpretation of Marxism which centered much more on worker self-management. While the socialist countries in the Soviet bloc, part of the Warsaw Pact, were heavily influenced by Moscow, Yugoslavia under Tito was part of the non-aligned movement. They weren't aligned with either side during the Cold War. After World War II was over and the communists took over, Tito basically said to Stalin, who wanted to make Yugoslavia part of the socialist bloc, "Thanks, but no thanks." And he decided to chart his own path.
This made Stalin a little angry, causing him to try to have Tito assassinated multiple times.
Unlike the other countries which would fall under Marxist-Leninist rule after World War II due to being liberated by the Red Army, Yugoslavia was able to pave its own way because the countries that would make up Yugoslavia were able to free themselves from fascism independently. Tito was a marshal prior to being leader of Yugoslavia and had huge military credibility. Now, what made the Yugoslav socialist experiment different from the Soviet Union? Well, for starters, workers actually had real power in running their workplaces through self-management systems. Unlike a system of top-down control whereby party bosses basically had the power of capitalist bosses, the Yugoslav experiment centered around worker self-management. Imagine having a real say in your company decisions rather than just being bossed around by managers. Unlike the top-down command economy of the USSR, Yugoslavia actually allowed for markets, and they also weren't afraid to trade with the West, which was a big no for the hardcore Stalinists. The combination of workers' self-directed enterprises while allowing for the sale of goods and services on the market is why the system was often called market socialism. This system of market socialism is promoted today by various Marxist intellectuals, most notably Richard Wolff, who has introduced many people, especially in America, to Marxist theory. However, many anti-revisionist Marxists, as well as ultra-left Marxists and Orthodox Marxists, tend to consider market socialism to be revisionist. But this is an ongoing debate in Marxist discourse. Another thing that was very interesting about the Yugoslav experiment was Tito's balancing act between Yugoslavia's different ethnic groups. And it was a tough balancing act, to say the least. Tito's slogan of brotherhood and unity wasn't just empty rhetoric. Uniting various ethnic groups with quite similar languages under a single country and nationality. Yugoslavia actually achieved a level of ethnic harmony that seems almost unimaginable given the brutal civil wars that followed its collapse in the 1990s. Now, while the Yugoslav experiment is often viewed a lot more favorably compared to the Soviet experiments, it wasn't a utopian paradise either. Yugoslavia was still a one-party state, albeit a much more decentralized one. It did have a lot of political repression, as well as economic problems like inflation and reliance on foreign debt. But compared to other socialist experiments at the time, Tito's Yugoslavia offered something genuinely different, a sort of third way between Soviet-style central planning and Western capitalism. Now, the fact that many former Yugoslavs today look back on the Tito era with nostalgia tells you something quite important. For all its flaws, Titoism showed that socialism didn't have to be this rigid top-down command economy
in which there are no markets, and a system that is subordinated to Moscow's will. It showed that socialism could take on different forms and adapt to local conditions. Titoism is a form of market socialism, but as we saw earlier, it's not the only kind. It's named after a leader mainly because Tito was just in power for so long and was just so well liked, so this ideology of Yugoslavia is named after him. Now, Titoism isn't the only ideology named after a communist leader. Castroism, also known as Fidelismo, is often used to describe the ideology of communist Cuba, Cuba under the rule of the Communist Party. It's generally described as a dynamic blend of Cuban nationalism, anti-imperialism, and some Marxist-Leninist influence. The official ideology of Cuba's ruling party is Marxism-Leninism, though, but tailored to Cuba's unique context. But what most Americans and even many communists tend to forget is that Fidel Castro initially wasn't even a communist.
I am not communism. I am not agree with communism.
Yep, you heard that right. He wasn't even a communist when he was leading the Cuban Revolution. Initially, the Cuban Revolution was rooted in resistance against the Batista regime, with an emphasis on progressive nationalism, not Marxist communism. While Che Guevara and many of those who participated in the Cuban Revolution were indeed committed communists, Castro himself explicitly denied being a communist and positioned himself as a nationalist seeking representative democracy.
Our political philosophy is representative democracy.
During his days as a lawyer turned activist turned revolutionary, Castro explicitly distanced himself from communism. The Cuban Revolution technically started in 1953 and wasn't over until 1959, when the revolutionaries finally took power. But it wasn't until 1961 when Castro declared Cuba to be a socialist transitionary state, officially aligning with the Soviet bloc. How did all this happen? When the United States economically isolated Cuba and supported the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba under Castro was essentially forced into the Soviet orbit. This alliance between Cuba and the USSR was cemented out of pragmatic necessity. But Castro's pragmatic adaptation of Marxism-Leninism wasn't entirely just cynical calculation. His hopes for collaboration with the United States had been thoroughly crushed by this point, and he claims to have genuinely been convinced by Marxism-Leninism after losing all hope in liberal reformism and the United States. But Castroism wasn't just Soviet communism with a Caribbean accent. Cuba developed distinctive characteristics that separated it from other socialist experiments. Rather than filling mass graves with dissidents like many other communist states did, especially the USSR, Castro primarily just exiled dissidents to Florida. I mean, that's literally how we got movies like Scarface. This more pragmatic approach, combined with Castro's genuine popularity, did avoid the most extreme repressive tendencies of other communist systems. Even the CIA admitted that it would be virtually impossible to remove Castro because of his genuine popular support, which is why the US government chose to use sanctions and the embargo to make economic conditions so brutal in Cuba that they would eventually revolt against the government. The US embargo created a crushing economic reality for Cuba. And it's not just the embargo either. The sanctions that the US imposes on Cuba have global ramifications. As a result of the sanctions, any business that deals with Cuba essentially is denied access to the American market for a certain period of time. To put it in more simpler terms, if businesses want to deal with Cuba, they can't really deal with America, and Cuban businesses are completely shut out of the American market. The population has really suffered as a result. After the Soviet Union fell, Cuba experienced what is called the special period of the 90s and early 2000s, which was absolutely devastating. I mean, imagine a society barely functioning without reliable oil supplies, cars barely working, and infrastructure falling apart. So why didn't they adopt the sort of market reforms that China and Vietnam did, which led to a lot of economic growth? I mean, Cuba looks like it's stuck in the 1970s. Its economy hasn't really grown that much. Yet Cuba rejected the full marketization path. But still, economic desperation has gradually forced Cuba to implement various limited market reforms. As a result, many critics on both sides claim that Cuba has either abandoned socialism or just hasn't embraced capitalism enough. At its core, Castroism represents a unique adaptation of Marxism-Leninism shaped by Cuban nationalism. It's a less coherent and dogmatic ideological framework than the Marxism-Leninism in the likes of Stalinist USSR, which is why the anti-revisionists tend to consider Castroism revisionist. Not just now, but like Cuba in general is revisionist, according to them. But at the end of the day, what we call Castroism is more or less a evolving response to Cuba's precarious position, trying to deal with superpowers and simply surviving as a little fish in a big pond next to a big shark. Now, it's important to note that Castroism is not the same as Guevarism, even though it did play a role in the Cuban Revolution. Guevarism is the ideology associated with the ideas and practices of the iconic Ernesto Che Guevara, by far the coolest and sexiest communist alive. Everyone likes Che Guevara. Even the biggest capitalist on earth will wear a Che Guevara t-shirt. Everyone likes Che Guevara because he's just so fucking cool like that. You can't hate the man.
This at least we can agree on. Planet of the Apes was a fine picture.
Che Guevara is like that one communist revolutionary that nobody hates unless you're a Cuban living in Florida whose granddaddy owned a something plantation in the Baptista regime. For those who were born yesterday, Che Guevara is of course the Argentinian revolutionary who helped play a pivotal role in the Cuban Revolution. And he died for our sins in Bolivia, assassinated by the CIA. After his death, Che Guevara became a larger-than-life Christ-like figure in Cuba, and in the world in general. Now, even before his death, while he was alive, Che Guevara is just like Riz on steroids. Like, look at this interview right here. I mean, he's being interviewed by a man, and the man looks like he's about to fall in love. Like, just look at this. Although Che Guevara is frequently put in the Marxist-Leninist camp, he had many distinct political ideas of his own that differed quite significantly from Marxism-Leninism. Those who have studied Che Guevara's individual writings often claim that he is sort of a crossover between Lenin, Trotsky, and Mao. While Guevaraism isn't exactly a political ideology that people commonly hold, he did pioneer a set of unique ideas of his own that would make up this thing called Guevaraism, which would inspire various revolutionaries in the Third World. And in the First World too. Some of the main ideas of Che Guevara include FOCO theory, the idea that a small mobile group of guerrilla fighters could ignite a revolution by leading through action, even before all social and economic conditions are perfect. Instead of waiting for the perfect material conditions for the revolution to happen, the guerrilla FOCO creates those conditions through direct confrontation with the state, inspiring the masses by example. It's a theory born out of the Cuban Revolution, where just 82 guerrilla fighters, including Che and Fidel Castro, launched a campaign from the mountains that somehow toppled the US-backed Batista regime. This showed that revolutions didn't need decades of party building. However, this was under a very particular context where a highly unpopular dictatorship had lost its legitimacy with its people and was seen to be foreign imposed, as he was a US-backed dictator after all. So when you just had 82 fellas go and basically coup the place and take power, not a whole lot of people objected. Plus, socialism was quite fashionable at the time, so they were like, F it, let's try this shit out. However, as we mentioned with our boy Fidel, the Cuban Revolution wasn't an explicit communist revolution, though Che Guevara was certainly a communist. Che Guevara described the philosophy behind FOCO theory quite clearly. Quote,
"Why does the guerrilla fighter fight? We must come to the inevitable conclusion that the guerrilla fighter is a social reformer, that he takes up arms responding to the angry protest of the people against their oppressors, and that he fights in order to change the social system that keeps all his unarmed brothers in ignominy and misery."
In a similar way to Mao, Che Guevara deviated from the Orthodox Marxist line of relying on the urban proletariat and instead placed his faith in the rural peasantry, seeing them as the key revolutionary force. The application of FOCO theory was to be fiercely anti-imperialist, targeting mainly the United States' influence in Latin America, with the broader aim of exporting revolution across the world, mainly the Third World, to topple imperialist-backed regimes. But here's where it gets complicated and tragic. Che Guevara tried to recreate the Cuban miracle in Bolivia, but this time the conditions weren't exactly as ripe. The peasants weren't mobilized, the Communist Party really wasn't on board, and Che, well, he was captured, executed, and ultimately became a martyr. FOCO theory, it turned out, wasn't a universal formula. FOCO theory simply overestimated the power of sheer will alone. However, Che Guevara's ideas were highly influential outside of Cuba. From Nicaragua to Colombia, from Angola to Vietnam, guerrilla movements flirted with FOCOism. Some of them found success, many of them were crushed, and interestingly enough, Guevara's ideas were actually influential in a lot of New Left activist militant groups, like the Weather Underground, which was a shit show, to say the least. But Che Guevara's contributions to Marxism weren't just tactical ones. He presented a vision for a new society, with a new person under that society. Che Guevara emphasized the cultivation of a socialist new man, inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch. Except, unlike Nietzsche's aristocratic conception of the Übermensch, the socialist new man was to be a tough, hardworking communist, voluntarily committed to the common good, and highly dedicated to the cause out of their own will, not through coercion. While Guevarism never really became an ideology of its own, and FOCOism didn't really prove to be a universally applicable model, Che Guevara's phantasmatic image largely persists. The romantic rifle-wielding rebel forging revolution from the margins. Now, despite all the Che Guevara t-shirts you might see, Guevarism as a distinct ideology never became all that prominent. It never even really became part of the official state ideology of Cuba under Castro. However, Cuba's socialist nationalism was very different from this other kind of socialist nationalism that we are about to talk about. And no, I'm not talking about the German kind. I'm talking about, you guessed it, North Korea. Juche is the official state ideology of the Democratic Republic of North Korea, crafted by none other than Kim Il-sung to justify the country's unique path to socialism. The term Juche literally translates to self-reliance, which is one of the ideology's core principles. The goal of Juche is independence from all foreign influence, not just capitalist influence, but influence from any foreign power. Juche is all about anti-imperialism and ultranationalist isolationism. I know what you're thinking, that doesn't sound very Marxist. And you'd be right. Now, I was debating whether or not to even include Juche in this video because the North Korean regime no longer even claims to be Marxist anymore. Juche is seen to be an entirely unique ideology of its own. However, during its early years, the North Korean leadership did call itself Marxist-Leninist, with Kim Il-sung initially framing Juche as a specific application of Marxist-Leninist principles suited to the Korean context. But over time, Juche distanced itself from Marxism-Leninism, especially as North Korea sought to assert its independence from the Soviet Union and even China. In doing so, the DPRK de-emphasized the importance of class struggle and emphasized loyalty to the state and leader instead. And to be fair, this kind of is a tendency you see with much of the Marxist-Leninist regimes in general. It was just on steroids in the case of Kim Il-sung. Seriously, the cult of personality that Kim Il-sung and his successors were able to cultivate makes the cults of Stalin and Mao look like nothing. Although funny enough, class struggle was sometimes used as a rhetorical ploy to smear internal opposition and dissent as class traitors. Sound familiar? Seriously, you notice this thing in the history of Marxism-Leninism, where it's really hard to tell who is actually committed to the ideas of Marxism-Leninism and who is just using all of this gobbledygook to justify their own power. In any case, it really doesn't matter because what matters is the consequences. By the 1970s, Juche officially replaced Marxism-Leninism as the guiding ideology of North Korea. To ostensibly preserve Korean sovereignty, North Korea's economy prioritizes domestic production over trade, with a fully state-controlled command economy, an ideal that, in practice, led to a lot of shortages and stagnation. The North Korean leadership claims that this is all for the purpose of self-reliance. Korea has been victim of a lot of colonialism, to say the least, and they've always been surrounded by much more powerful, bigger countries, and the Korean War didn't exactly do much to help their paranoia. However, critics of the regime have argued that the real reason why they haven't allowed for the kind of market reforms that you see in Vietnam and China is because the North Korean leadership is very scared of the economic growth that these reforms would bring, leading to new rival elites propping up as a result of the capitalist reforms, who could potentially challenge the political hegemony of the Kim dynasty. Put simply, with market reforms, a lot of new people become rich, and these people could challenge the dynasty's power. And by having foreign trade, you now just simply liberalize the country a lot more that allows for more foreign influence. This makes North Korea significantly different from the likes of Cuba, Vietnam, and China. While Vietnam and China aren't exactly democratic, to say the least, they have a lot more meritocratic means of choosing their leaders, with various rival elite factions contesting for power within the party. Whereas with the case with North Korea, it's not just one-party rule, but rule of one faction. It is literally a family that has a monopoly over political power, with Kim Jong-un's sister being most likely to be a successor. This makes North Korea a lot more like a hereditary monarchy rather than a democratic dictatorship, which is what China claims to be. While North Korea has become one of the most isolated, totalitarian countries in history, arguably the only totalitarian country left, the absolute hostility that the United States and South Korea have shown to North Korea have allowed the Kim regime to perpetually rationalize their grip on power and ever-growing state repression, because they can always invoke the threat that the Western imperialists are trying to overthrow them. However, in the end, it is only the North Korean population who have to suffer. To repeat again, North Korea doesn't even claim to be Marxist anymore. I have no idea why Marxist-Leninists on the internet defend it so much. They like to pretend that North Korea is just another Marxist-Leninist state like Cuba, Vietnam, and China. It's not. Like, you could find quite a few Marxist-Leninist Twitter accounts standing Kim Jong-un and screaming Juche gang. And to any of those people who happen to be watching this video,
not this time. No, not this time. It's totally made up.
People are not fleeing South Korea to North Korea for free healthcare. In all seriousness, no one outside of North Korea seriously believes in the ideology of Juche. That is, unless you're a 16-year-old white kid on the internet LARPing as an anti-imperialist Korean. And the reason why South Koreans don't believe it isn't just because they're all brainwashed. Now that brings us to the end of all the regime ideologies. Now we're going to talk about some of the Marxist ideologies that never got to be tried. There are a certain few pure Marxist ideologies that some people get attracted to, especially if they see that all of the actually existing socialist regimes that we already discussed aren't really socialist, but rather revisionist capitalist regimes with a red flag, that are Marxist in name only. One of these categories of Marxist ideologies that never really got to be tried, but is quite attractive to some people, is the broader category that could be called left communism. Left communism? What the f***? That sounds unnecessarily redundant. Well, that's kind of the point. Left communists are supposed to be the far left of the far left. It's like super communism. The notion of left communism was first popularized in Lenin's book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which critiques what he deems as ultra-leftists. The target of Lenin's critique were other Marxists who perceived themselves to be more left-wing than Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And these types often critique the Bolsheviks for not being socialist enough. Left communists are sort of like the too cool for school crowd of Marxism. They rejected Stalin, Trotsky, and everybody who was actually in power to implement Marxism. It allows them to play as the pure types of Marxism who never had to get their hands dirty. But in all seriousness, left communism is a rather broad label. It encompasses various 20th century ultra-left Marxist tendencies that don't have much in common with each other, except for the fact that they were considered to be the left of mainstream Marxism-Leninism. There are really two main camps when it comes to this category of left communism. On the one hand, you have the Council Communists, which mainly emerged in the Netherlands and Germany, and on the other hand, the infamous mimetic Amedeo Bordiga, founder of the Italian Communist Party. Legend has it that Bordiga died from eating too much lasagna. But Bordiga has had somewhat of a mimetic resurgence in recent years, with his brand of left communism becoming popular in some niche spheres of the internet. Now, Council Communism and Bordigism are completely different, so when somebody calls somebody a left com, you really gotta ask them what they mean, because one of them is closer to anarchism and the other one is closer to Stalinism. Let's briefly look at the differences between these two ideologies. Council communism is a political ideology that advocates for the self-governance of society through workers' councils, known as Soviets. Yes, the origin of the word Soviet did not emerge in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union called itself the Soviet Union because it was supposed to be a worker state, but Soviets existed long before, and were supposed to be organs of worker power. Workers' councils are supposed to basically be these democratic self-managed assemblies formed by workers in industries to manage their own workplaces and communities. They're also supposed to serve a political function by representing the interests of workers in various industries in the government. Council communism emerged in the early 20th century after World War I, pioneered mainly by Marxist figures in Germany and the Netherlands, such as Anton Pannekoek and Otto Ruhl. Council communism is considered to be quite far left even on the Marxist political compass because it emerged to the left of both Trotsky and Lenin. While Trotsky and Lenin both supported workers' councils, they didn't believe in a system in which the workers' councils would be the main organs of political power. Trotsky believed in radical representative democracy, similar to Marx's original vision, and for a time so did Lenin. Yes, Lenin and the Bolsheviks originally claimed to be defenders of the Constituent Assembly, and it's part of how they justified the October takeover. But when the Bolsheviks were about to lose an election to the SRs, Lenin now dismissed the Constituent Assembly as bourgeois democracy and abolished it, and gave temporary power to the workers' councils, claiming that the workers' councils represented a higher form of democracy. This was his way of appealing to the ultra-left, in his effort to undermine the more moderate left. Yes, isn't it ironic? Lenin went from trying to appeal to the ultra-left by saying all power to the Soviets, only to dismiss them all as ultra-leftists once the Bolsheviks took power and were firmly establishing their one-party state and trying to justify it, all in the name of suppressing counter-revolution and all that. Understandably, the Council Communists were like, what the f, dude? You said all power to the Soviets, now you're having censorship in the workers' councils where they barely have significant power at all, and the ability to actually participate them is limited by the secret police, who lock up dissenters and really prevent their free expression. And as we mentioned earlier, the workers' councils became a largely insignificant institution in the Soviet Union. Now, Council Communists really were ultra-left, make no mistake. Like, definitely to the left of Marx himself. The Council Communists generally rejected participating in elections, which they saw as a waste of time. And even more radically, they rejected participating in unions, which they saw as operating on the terms of the capitalist order. As we recall, Lenin thought this too in his criticism of trade union consciousness. But it is quite funny that when your whole thing is about workers' councils, to be against trade unions is rather interesting. Instead of participating in elections or trade unions, Council Communists emphasize direct collective control over the means of production. How, you might ask? Council Communists don't just reject vanguardism, they reject political parties in general, because they see them as intrinsically hierarchical and prone to creating new elites. So instead of a party leading the working class, they believe that the workers themselves must organize spontaneously and autonomously. The core belief of Council Communism is that socialism can only be realized through decentralized bottom-up governance by workers themselves, rather than by a state apparatus, which they see as oppressive, regardless if it's a bourgeois capitalist state or a state of socialist bureaucrats. Council Communists like to present themselves as anti-authoritarian, as their vision of socialism is centered on self-management and democratic coordination through a network of worker councils. Sound like anarchism? Well, yeah, it does. Council Communists critique the Soviet Union for being too capitalistic and undemocratic. Unlike Lenin, Trotsky, or Kautsky, the Council Communists believe that the workers' councils should not be subordinated to a party state, as they were in the Soviet Union. The Council Communists celebrated the Russian Revolution, but saw what happened in the USSR as a defeat of socialism, a total betrayal. Now, Bordigism, on the other hand, is considered to be ultra-left for completely different reasons. While, like the Council Communists, Bordiga also rejected participating in electoral politics and trade unions, but Bordiga didn't care all that much about democracy or most of the stuff that the Council Communists care about. Bordiga was very much on board with vanguardism and was big on ideological purity within the party, which is why he saw himself as the true Leninist. His main beef with the USSR was that he thought it was too capitalist and didn't move to communism fast enough. Fun fact, Bordiga was one of the few people in history ballsy enough to diss Joseph Stalin to his face. Bordiga's ideas developed as a critique of both Soviet-style Marxism, especially under Stalin, and the more reformist or parliamentary forms of socialism. Central to Bordiga's critique is his disdain for the cult of leadership, asserting that the party should act as a collective brain guiding the revolutionary movement. Bordiga had a particular disdain for activism as well, and what he saw is liberal individualism. He saw any leftist activity that wasn't part of the revolution itself as a mere distraction. But unlike those who believed in worker autonomy and spontaneous uprisings, Bordiga insisted on a very strict, uncompromising revolutionary approach pushed by a top-down party. Bordiga's ideas have been subject to debate and criticism in niche Marxist circles. Some view him as more Leninist than Lenin, or even more Stalinist than Stalin, given his emphasis on party centralization and his dismissal of democracy. Like he saw himself as the true heir to Lenin. Although Marx and Engels never actually advocated for a vanguard party, Bordiga's claimed to strictly follow Marx's original writings, opposing attempts to build socialism in just one nation, which is another reason why they saw the Soviet Union as a deviation from authentic Marxism. Now, if you want my opinion, Council Communism and Bordigism are really popular with the Zoomers mainly because they are ideologies that haven't been tried, and there is no baggage to associate with. So if you're new and getting into Marxism and you don't like all that tanky Stalinist stuff, people often get attracted to this sort of thing because they see it as the pure Marxism that wasn't tried. The same applies to the next ideology that we're about to discuss. Ah yes, Rosa Luxemburg. Absolute legend, certified girl boss, but subject to many romanticized myths. Luxemburgism is a term used to describe interpretations of Marxism supposedly based on the thought of Rosa Luxemburg, a revolutionary Marxist theorist and a key player in the German Revolution. She is most famous for her book Reformer Revolution. which was written in response to the revisionist gradualist approach of Edward Bernstein, which we discussed earlier. But in reality, Luxemburgism isn't really a thing. It's a term never claimed by Rosa herself, or her closest comrades, and Rosa Luxemburg's philosophy tends to be highly misunderstood, even by the people who try to claim her as part of their ideological camp. And yeah, it's cool to idolize revolutionaries who never got to get their hands dirty, who died before being tested by power. So Rosa Luxemburg will forever be one of these icons that is safe to like, kind of like Che Guevara. And she represents one of these tragedies because the German Revolution was ultimately shut down, partially because these Social Democrats allowed the Freikorps to kill her. And it's forever why Marxists tend to hate these Social Democrats, even though it was the right-wing faction of the Social Democrats who decided on this. Most people were horrified. There's this prevalent myth about Rosa Luxemburg as an idealist fixated on spontaneity as opposed to the revolutionary organization of Vladimir Lenin. Rosa is often presented as the total opposite of Lenin, the more nicer, democratic alternative to Lenin that we could have had, if only the German Revolution wasn't shut down. In reality, though, Luxemburg did believe in the importance of revolutionary parties as guides and educators for the working class, but she strongly opposed elitism and centralized control that stifled democracy. For Luxemburg, true socialism required active mass participation and could not be imposed from above by any authoritarian structure. She believed in a transitionary state, but not a one-party state. While critical of Lenin's centralization and the Bolshevik suppression of opposition parties, Rosa's critique was not a rejection of leadership as a whole, but rather a defense of democratic self-determination within the proletarian party. She was closer to Kautsky in this regard. But she was also kind of to the left of Kautsky because she believed in the general strike as a mode of activity, and was a lot more pessimistic about participating in parliamentary activity, which she saw as something that tamed the workers' movement rather than radicalized it. Whereas Kautsky believed that you need to participate in elections in order to build legitimacy with the proletariat. Because if a party is not popular enough to get enough votes of the working class, how could it possibly be popular enough to maintain a one-party state without relying on suppression of dissent all the time? And to be fair, Kautsky was kind of right about this. And it's why he was highly critical of the Bolsheviks. But wait, we're not talking about Kautsky. Back to Rosa. Despite Rosa Luxemburg's iconic status, Luxemburgism never emerged as a prominent, coherent political tendency, even after her death. And contrary to popular belief, Rosa Luxemburg was not a council communist, nor was she a libertarian communist. Wait, libertarian communism? Didn't we talk about that already? Isn't that what left communism was? Yeah, no. This is an important distinction to make. Libertarian communism is not to be mistaken with left communism. People often use the terms libertarian communism and left communism interchangeably, but make no mistake, they are not the same. Being a libcom is not the same thing as being a leftcom. So let's talk about what exactly being a libertarian communist is. Ah yes, libertarian communism. It's basically like saying, I'm a communist, but, I'm chill. I'm libertarian, man. I don't want to police you. I don't want to send you to the gulag, man. I'm libertarian. We won't send the stormtroopers to go to your house, to take away your family, to take away your toothbrush, to make you all share the same toilet. We're libertarian. We're chill. In all seriousness, libertarian communism is a real thing, and it's where the term libertarian actually originated. Yes, leftists originated the term libertarian, not these right-wing libertarian capitalists. Libertarian communists typically want to abolish both the state and capitalism. Now wait, you might be thinking, don't Marxists want to do that as well? Here's the difference. Marxists don't really believe in abolishing the state, but rather that the state will eventually wither away as class conflict is overcome. Once the proletariat become the class in charge and transition towards a socialist society, eventually they'll transition to a high-phase communist society, which is classless. When you have no classes, why would you need a state? Because for Marxists, the whole purpose of the state was one class dominating another class. The state, according to Marxists, is an expression of class rule, whereby some classes dominate the rest. The idea is that once class conflict was overcome, why would we need a state? Why don't we just people live their lives? You don't need a monopoly on violence for one class to squash another. However, I actually think the Marxists get the theory of the state very wrong. I have a video called The Capitalist Matrix, which I highly recommend watching, which goes over this theory of the state and how it's actually more complicated than that. Marxists tend to disagree with anarchists on the origin of the state as well. Marxists tend to believe that the state is a product of class conflict, is the result of class conflict, whereas anarchists believe that the state is what creates class conflict. Is that once this hierarchy is established and a monopoly on violence is established, it can perpetuate class. It's sort of like a chicken before the egg thing, because it's very clear that they're both related, but which one comes first is, debatable. But there have been a few real-world examples of actually existing anarchism, and cases that could be classified as libertarian communism, such as Chaz, or CHOP, or whatever the they renamed it to. You remember that autonomous zone that a bunch of Antifa kids wanted to create during the Black Lives Matter protest, where they created a commune without any cops or money? And yet, somehow a black guy ended up getting shot?
First-degree murder charges against a man they say is responsible for killing 19.
But in all seriousness, there actually have been a few examples of libertarian communism working in practice, albeit in a small scale. For example, the libcoms often like to bring up the state of Catalonia during the Spanish Revolution, when workers and peasants collectively managed factories and farms through direct democracy, before getting crushed by the fascists. Fun fact, George Orwell, a self-described democratic socialist, actually wrote a book on the Spanish Revolution called Homage to Catalonia. Now, similar libertarian communist experiments emerged in Ukraine as well, from 1917 to 1921. There are also various recent examples of libertarian communism that one could point to, like Argentina's worker-occupied factories following the 2001 economic crisis. While it might seem easy for critics to dismiss libertarian communism as utopian and idealistic, what libcoms often like to argue is that what is truly utopian is believing that state bureaucracy can lead to freedom. They like to point to how Soviet-style state socialism produced many of capitalism's hierarchies and alienation, just with party bosses replacing the private capitalist bosses. The key question remains as to whether such a decentralized libertarian communist system could effectively coordinate a complex modern economy without markets or state planning. Today, libcoms often like to point to the existing autonomous regions of Rojava in Syria and the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico as examples of libertarian communism in practice, in that they tend to be more democratic and decentralized. Rojava is guided by the ideology originally conceived by the theorist Murray Bookchin, whereas Chiapas in Mexico has its origins in a vague variant of Marxism-Leninism and influenced by Mao Zedong thought, which rejected the Soviet Union and China as models for socialism and sought to build its own decentralized, more localized, and democratic alternative. However, its influence has been mostly confined to Chiapas, Mexico. Now, I know I didn't spend as much time on libertarian communism as I did on some of the other tendencies, and I probably came off more dismissive than I wanted to, because I actually have a lot of respect for that tradition. The only reason I didn't spend much time on them is because this is a types of Marxism video, not a types of anarchism video. Libertarian communism includes tendencies that are sort of between those two categories. But if this video gets enough likes and comments, then I might just do a video on the types of anarchism. But now let's get back to finishing talking about all the Marxist tendencies.
Yeah! Woohoo! Yahoo!
Autonomist Marxism, also known as Automatism, emerged mainly in Italy, pioneered by thinkers like Antonio Negri, Mario Tronti, and Luigi Maggioni. Just kidding. Who helped shape these ideas during a time when workers and students in Italy were protesting and striking on their own terms, without waiting for traditional unions or political vanguard parties to step in. Automatism was sort of like an awkward attempt to combine aspects of the old left and the nascent new left. The automatists believed that the working class could organize itself autonomously, without a centralized vanguard party. Unsurprisingly, the automatists clashed with the official Communist Party of Italy, which was much bigger, and was Marxist-Leninist at the time, but was adopting this new politics called Eurocommunism. More on that later. While based in a real movement, automatism is sometimes embraced by Western Marxist intellectuals who want to distance themselves from the authoritarianism of Soviet communism, while being more fashionable than plain old Orthodox Marxists or crusty Trotskyists. Automatism is another one of those hip, eclectic Marxist ideologies, kind of like Situationism. Situationism is when radical leftists want to abolish the family and replace it with situationships. Just kidding. In all seriousness, Situationism refers to the ideas and practices of the Situationist International, popularized by a thinker named Guy Debord in the 1950s to 1960s. Situationism was a radical intellectual and artistic movement that combined Marxism, anarchism, and surrealism to critique how capitalism permeates everyday life. A famous book associated with Situationist thought is Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle. Yes, that book everyone pretends to have read, but usually they can't get past the first chapter because it's written horribly and unnecessarily complicated. Like, seriously, what is up with these French intellectuals? It seems like they compete with each other over who can be the most inaccessible. Now, what was Guy Debord on with this whole spectacle thing? Well, he was referring to a system where reality is replaced by commodified images and mediated experiences. Instead of authentic connections and self-determined lives, people become passive consumers of illusions, shaped by advertising, media, and consumer culture. The Situationists sought to disrupt this passive existence by creating situations, moments that subverted the banality of everyday life under capitalism, and revealed the falsehoods of consumer life through activities that would wake people up from their false consciousness. One example of Situationist praxis is this thing that they call détournement, where they would take mainstream cultural symbols like ads or propaganda and twist them into more radical messages, often humorous critiques of the system. Think of what they were doing as sort of like the equivalent of modern meme activism. They thought that they were waking people up, but others saw them as nothing more than a bunch of out-of-touch students doing art and theory and trying to call it activism. Now, the Situationist International did play a notable role in the revolutionary uprisings of May 1968. The ethos of the Situationist International is captured in their slogan, "Be realistic but demand the impossible." They rejected gradual reforms in favor of the complete reimagining of society as we know it. Situationism's emphasis on reclaiming life from commodification and fostering genuine human connection continues to inspire contemporary artist movements, as some degree of activism, and critiques of digital consumer culture, highlighting that revolutionary change can begin with everyday acts of resistance and creativity. Is this just a bunch of French intellectual airheads throwing shit at the wall and calling it activism? Or were these Situationists onto something? Let me know what you think in the comments. But the tragedy is that Guy Debord would end up blowing his brains out. Now, when you sit back and think about it, it's truly astonishing how many failed Marxist tendencies came out of the Western world. It's quite a tragic irony of history, especially when considering that Marx himself predicted that the revolution would happen first in the Western countries. However, other Marxists argue that these failed Marxist tendencies do not invalidate Marxism as a whole because at this point, they all strayed very far from the core tenets of classical Marxism. Now, if you saw my previous video explaining the history of how the ideas of Marx and Engels were eventually turned into the doctrine known as Marxism, then you would know that Marxism originally came out of the Western world, particularly in Germany under the SPD, led by a man named Karl Kautsky, who is hardly discussed and poorly understood by today's so-called Marxists. This brings us to Orthodox Marxism, a section I was originally going to discuss near the beginning of this video given how important it is to Marxist history, but I figured it was too niche to start with, because most people who call themselves Leninists or Marxists for that matter today don't really know very much about it at all. But Orthodox Marxism is essential to understand when it comes to the history of Marxism before Leninism. So let's talk about it for a moment. And now I know what you're probably thinking. Does this mean Marxism with extra rules, a dress code, and mandatory hymn singing?
Sing the song, boys!
Not quite. Orthodox Marxism isn't really a sect or a rigid doctrine or anything. Orthodox Marxism is really just a term used to designate a dominant interpretation of Marxism from the 19th to early 20th centuries. And here's the twist. It's not orthodox in the sense of religious dogma. It's orthodox just in the sense of sticking to what Marx and Engels originally wrote. At its core, Orthodox Marxism is about the belief in Marx's materialist conception of history, historical materialism, being the ultimate guiding framework for understanding how societies develop and change. This means focusing on class struggle, the modes of production, like feudalism or capitalism, and the idea that economic structures fundamentally shape politics. culture, and even ideas. Orthodox Marxism places heavy emphasis on the inevitability of capitalism's collapse. But why? Because of its internal contradictions. Think of the boom-bust cycles, worker exploitation, and the concentration of wealth, etc. These, according to Orthodox Marxists, are the seeds of capitalism's self-destruction and the birth of socialism. The dialectical process that Marx talks about, that's at the center here too. One of the heavy hitters of the Orthodox Marxism camp is, of course, Karl Kautsky, who was once considered to be the high priest of Marxism, and was the man responsible for first turning the German SPD, the Social Democratic Party, Marxist. And then there's figures like August Bebel, who co-founded the German SPD and also played a pivotal role in pushing for socialism through mass democratic movements. And let's not forget Georgy Plekhanov, the so-called father of Russian Marxism, who probably played the most important role in bringing Marxist ideas to Russia. Before falling out of favor due to his weak stances on World War I and Lenin's barrage of polemics against him, Karl Kautsky was once considered to be the Pope of Marxism. In fact, the very idea of Orthodox Marxism was basically started by Kautsky. Kautsky was the first guy to defend the Orthodox Marxist perspective against Edward Bernstein's revisionism. In Marxist theory, the concepts of revisionism and anti-revisionism represent two opposing approaches to interpreting Marxist ideas. There are many different ways you can interpret it, but at its core, revisionism usually refers to efforts to revise Marxist principles by distorting Marxism in order to justify a political agenda that is fundamentally incompatible with the core tenets of Marxist doctrine, namely the commitment to class struggle and proletarian revolution. Anti-revisionism is all about opposing this in favor of Marxist politics that claim to adhere to the core tenets of Marxist communism. This whole revisionism ordeal might sound like niche pedantic nonsense, but it's actually a very significant theme that pops out throughout the history of communism. And trust me, it gets really obscure. Revisionism dates back to the 19th century debates surrounding the work of Edward Bernstein, a German Marxist, who totally shook things up by suggesting that capitalism wasn't actually collapsing, as Marx had predicted. Instead, Bernstein argued that it was evolving, even stabilizing, through reforms that democratized the system and gave workers better wages, giving them less incentive to be for revolution. In his book, Evolutionary Socialism, Bernstein proposed that socialism could be achieved gradually, through peaceful reform rather than violent revolution, which of course Marx emphasized in the Communist Manifesto. This was a bold claim, and one that was becoming increasingly popular, but it didn't sit well with everyone. Many Marxists saw Bernstein's ideas as a betrayal of the revolutionary edge that defined Marxism. They saw this as a concession to the capitalist system. And that's where the anti-revisionists come in. Kautsky was the first to argue against Bernstein's perspective, and then after that, it was Rosa Luxemburg, with her famous text, Reform or Revolution. The anti-revisionists like Rosa and Kautsky positioned themselves as the defenders of Marxist orthodoxy. Now, to be clear, most Marxists aren't against updating Marxist theory or adding new ideas to it, as of course you need to do that in order to update the theory for new economic times and different contexts. For classical Marxists, though, what really mattered when it came to revisionism was that the fundamental core principles of Marxist politics were being preserved, particularly the commitment to class struggle and the fidelity to communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, ideas which definitely distinguished Marx from other socialists at the time. However, what would count as a revisionist would become increasingly blurry as Marxists eventually weaponized it against each other for various different purposes and in many different ways. Sometimes accusations of revisionism would contain an element of truth, while also being used as a tactic to defame political opponents and legitimize one's own political positions or one's political power. Ironically, Lenin would go on to call Kautsky a revisionist, the guy who popularized this whole thing, in some infamous polemics against him, like the renegade Kautsky, which would forever destroy Kautsky's reputation. Like for real, if you ask most Marxist-Leninists or even Leninists what they think of Kautsky, they usually haven't even read any of Kautsky's work, but they usually hate him just because of these polemics. They've only heard Kautsky bad, and that's their knee-jerk reaction. What ultimately allowed the Orthodox Marxist vision to fall out of favor and for the Leninist vision to triumph as the dominant form of Marxism was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were able to gain power and keep it after the Russian Revolution and October takeover, whereas the subsequent German Revolution was defeated, and it failed elsewhere in Europe. Now let's not forget Georgy Plekhanov, the so-called founder of Russian Marxism, who is most important for bringing Marx's works to Russia. Now, being an Orthodox Marxist, Georgy Plekhanov insisted that Russia go through 2 stages before it is ready for socialism. First was to topple the Tsar and establish a liberal democratic regime and adopt capitalism to develop the productive forces of Russia. Then, in the next stage, Marxists would organize the working class that capitalism would produce to overthrow the democratic capitalist regime in Russia, and to then usher in socialism once Russia was more accustomed to democratic norms and was wealthy enough for socialism to be prosperous. It was the view of the Russian Orthodox Marxists that there was little that could be done to radically speed up the stages of history. At first, Plekhanov and his fellow Russian Marxists were just a tiny faction. But by the 1890s, their influence grew massively. And in 1898, at a conference in Minsk, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was founded. It founded the journal called Iskra, which translates to the word spark, because it aimed to spark revolt. Now, despite Plekhanov's early prominence, his leadership was soon eclipsed by a younger man who had followed in his footsteps. That man was none other than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Okay, now that we have discussed Orthodox Marxism, let's discuss one of the most heterodox forms of Marxism, Christian Marxism, better known as liberation theology. What if I told you that there's a whole tendency of Marxist thought that comes out of the church? Yes, Marxism, with Bible verses. Welcome to liberation theology, a current you could think of as Marxist Christianity, or Christian Marxism. Or if you want to sound extra academic about it, a theological political synthesis that treats Marxism as an analytical tool and the gospel as a revolutionary manifesto. Now, there have been a wide variety of Christian socialist political movements. In fact, there is so much that can be said about that alone that I might make an entire video about it. Liberation theology represents a distinct category of Christian socialism, a more radical, insurgent kind of Christian socialism, one that tends to be more influenced by Marxism than other Christian socialist tendencies. Unlike most Marxists who saw religion as the opium of the people, these Christian Marxists acknowledge that religion can be an opiate, but that it could also be a hammer to smash the establishment. But they didn't actually use the hammer and sickle very much in their iconography, because that was associated with the godless communism of the Soviet Union, and they wanted to reach the masses, most of which were religious. Think of it this way, if most Marxists read Capital, these liberation theology guys also read Exodus, the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. To them, that was the original class struggle. The Pharaoh was the bourgeoisie, the Red Sea was the revolution, and God? Well, God was on the side of the oppressed. Liberation theology emerged out of the brutal conditions of Cold War Latin America, a region that was ravaged by poverty, military dictatorships, and good old CIA-backed coups. Amidst this chaos, some radical priests, nuns, and theologians started to look around and go, maybe the church shouldn't just pray for the poor, maybe it should actually do something for them? How about that? Radical idea. Now, this wasn't just Sunday school with slightly spicier politics. They weren't just cafeteria Catholics. These folks were out in the streets, organizing poor communities, challenging authoritarian regimes, and calling out capitalism as the root of material suffering, and one of the root causes of tempting people into evil. There's this one particular quote that perfectly encapsulates the worldview of liberation theology.
When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist.
There are various examples of liberation theology movements that we could draw on. Let's go through a few very quickly. In El Salvador, liberation theology helped galvanize the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, a coalition of leftist guerrilla groups whose ranks were filled with peasants radicalized by both Marx and the gospel. One of the most famous political figures here was Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated by a right-wing death squad after he called on soldiers to stop killing civilians. In Nicaragua, liberation theology played a crucial role in the 1979 Sandinista revolution. Several priests literally joined the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, most famously Father Ernesto Cardenal, a Catholic priest, poet, and revolutionary who served as the Minister of Culture after the revolution. Imagine if the US Secretary of Education also led Mass and quoted Marx. That's basically what this guy was like. Meanwhile, in Peru, you had figures like Gustavo Gutierrez, often considered to be the founding father of liberation theology. His book titled A Theology of Liberation literally coined the term. His book didn't just quote the Bible, it turned it into a weapon for the oppressed. Now, unsurprisingly, liberation theology led to some serious tensions with the Vatican, especially under Pope John Paul II. The Catholic hierarchy worried that liberation theology was just Marxism and clerical robes. And liberation theology really terrified the CIA. Yes, the CIA published entire documents worrying that liberation theology could become a gateway drug to communism. Because God forbid the poor get any ideas to actually put the religion that is preached to them into practice. One CIA report literally described liberation theology as, quote, the joining of two powerful symbolic forces, Marxism and Christianity.
Okay, that was epic.
But that's the thing. Liberation theology scared a lot of powerful people. Not because it was atheist, but because it actually took Christianity seriously, using it not as an opiate, but as a call to revolt. Now, since this is the only sect of explicitly religious Marxism that we're talking about, we should probably address the elephant in the room. Marxists have historically been seen to be atheist and very hostile to religion. So, how can liberation theology really be Marxist? Well, that depends who you ask. Now, initially I wasn't sure as to whether to include liberation theology in this video at all because some debate as to how Marxist it really is. But at this point, we can kind of see how most of these so-called Marxist ideologies throughout history deviated significantly from classical Marxism. So at this point, I cover all ideologies that have called themselves Marxist or have been explicitly influenced by Marxism and have adopted it into their political strategy and rhetoric to some degree. Liberation theology movements weren't out here preaching dialectical materialism in Sunday sermons, nor were they quoting the German ideology at Mass. For liberation theology, Marxism was a tool, not a new gospel, a lens, a pair of glasses to see through the bullshit of capitalist exploitation and understand the structural roots of poverty, rather than merely praying for it to go away. The theologians who advocated liberation theology weren't Marxist because they believed in Marx. They were Marxists because they believed in Jesus. They believed in actually implementing Jesus's values and principles. And they saw Marx as a very brilliant social scientist who explained why the capitalist system prevents this from happening. For them, it wasn't that Marxism was incompatible with Christianity. It was capitalism that was incompatible with Christianity. And while it is true that Marx's atheism did present somewhat of a theological contradiction, liberation theologians weren't looking to convert Marxists. Rather, they were looking to radicalize Christians. Many Marxists today will believe that they should be tolerant towards religion at the very least, and that the way in which actually existing socialism regarded religion was a big mistake. In fact, you will find many people who see themselves as religious who will be Marxists, and believe that Marxism is compatible with religion to some extent. So for those who assume that Marxism and religion are like oil and water, just remember, there were priests out there who read Das Kapital after communion, and some of them led major radical movements. All in all, liberation theology was a powerful movement for those who wanted to fight injustice with both the pen of Marx and the cross of Christ. Now, liberation theology was primarily a major force in Latin America, but now we'll turn to some of the prominent socialist movements in Europe. This brings us to Eurocommunism, a significant yet highly misunderstood political tendency. Eurocommunism was a political movement that emerged in the 1970s in Western Europe. It deviated from both Soviet-style Marxism and traditional Orthodox Marxism. It was meant to be sort of a third way between revolutionary Marxism and social democracy. You could look at it like the European attempt at democratic socialism, but a bit more radical. After all, it was called Eurocommunism, not Eurosocialism, for a reason. The label Eurocommunism usually refers to parties that consider themselves to be Marxist with the long-term goal of one day eventually achieving a fully communist society. Whereas non-communist democratic socialists aren't usually convinced by the idea of communism, or at the very least, they don't think it's possible or worth considering until socialism is achieved. From there, maybe they'll consider. Those who call themselves democratic socialists in the modern day, while influenced by Marxist ideas a lot of the time, they don't usually believe in the ideal of a classless, stateless society, and hence why they don't call themselves communists. However, the Eurocommunists were indeed real Marxists, who did want to espouse a revolutionary politics, but also didn't want to be like the Soviet models. which weren't really desirable for people living in the Western world. They also thought that after World War II and increasing democratization, it was now possible to actually achieve socialism and eventually communism democratically. Like the Democratic Socialists, Eurocommunists emphasized pluralism, civil liberties, and a democratic path to socialism. However, different kinds of Eurocommunists would often disagree with each other as to how much they would want to change the existing liberal democratic system in order to make it more democratic and more socialist after they would hypothetically take power. Eurocommunism came in both moderate and more radical forms, emerging in countries like Italy, France, Portugal, and Spain. It was probably the biggest in Italy. In fact, there are multiple moments in which the Italian Communist Party could have taken power, first being after World War II, when the partisans helped liberate Italy from fascism. They had the means to do so, but funny enough, it was actually the Soviet Union who directed them to not do so, partly as a way to appease the West, so that the USSR could bolster its economy after having it be virtually destroyed during World War II. In Italy, there were multiple elections where the Italian Communist Party was very close to coming to power. In one election in particular, where the Italian Communist Party was said to have actually won the election, but allegedly was rigged, and there was a lot of foreign meddling. You know, the extent to whether you believe this, I would look at the evidence for yourself. Operation Gladio was also another attempt at subverting communism in Italy. Eurocommunism was the product of communist sympathizers in Europe becoming disillusioned with the Soviet Union after learning about all of the horrors of the Stalin period and after the Stalin period as well, particularly the suppression of the Prague Spring, the revolts of Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1968, which ended any hopes that the system could be reformed and become more humane. Any attempts at reforming actually existing socialism were kind of crushed, and as a result, this led the Western European communist parties to distance themselves from Soviet orthodoxy and Marxism-Leninism in general. Another big part of the rise of Eurocommunism was the collapse of right-wing dictatorships in Portugal, Spain, and Greece in the mid-1970s, along with the economic crisis of that era in general, which created a very particular context in which Eurocommunists became convinced that capitalism was enduring its final crisis and would eventually allow for democratic socialist parties to be elected to power. Despite achieving some level of success, like almost winning elections in Italy and briefly forming a coalition government in Portugal, Eurocommunism ultimately failed, like everywhere.
It doesn't really work, does it?
The reasons for Eurocommunism's failure are highly debated. The economic crises of the 1970s made the ambitions of Eurocommunist reform seem pretty utopian, and the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s eroded collective visions in favor of individualism instead. Quite simply, Eurocommunism just wasn't really aligning with the zeitgeist at the time, which was moving more in favor of neoliberalism and individualism. There would be a third way strategy that would emerge, but not a third way between communism and democratic socialism. It would be a third way between Reaganite neoliberalism and lukewarm social democracy, which would ultimately make up what people call Blairism or third-way neoliberalism. Kind of progressive neoliberalism that's very left-wing on some social issues and pays lip service even to some left-wing economic issues, but ultimately accepts the consensus of privatization, deregulation, and letting the market just figure it out. At the same time, Eurocommunist parties struggled to engage with new social movements like feminism and environmentalism, ceding ground to social democrats who would eventually become neoliberals, who were much better at absorbing middle-class grievances. Not only that, but as Cold War tensions began to heat up again between the US and the USSR, particularly in the 80s, the Eurocommunist ideal of a peaceful road to socialism seemed increasingly naive, mainly because most European countries were pro-NATO and didn't really want to piss off their American allies by flirting with this communism thing. To make things even worse, the failure of Gorbachev's reforms confirmed the suspicion that communism in any way, shape, or form was just unfixable. It was doomed from the start. And as China and Vietnam were increasingly taking the marketization road, it was seen that there was no alternative, and Eurocommunist aspirations seemed like a pipe dream. But a big problem within all of this was the Eurocommunist Party's inability to articulate a coherent strategy or maintain a direct identity. It became all too easy for social democrats to just steal their votes by just adopting some of their policies, without having the baggage of the word communism tied to its name. And the Eurocommunists would also experience some of the same issues that social democratic parties were plagued by, like the inability to provide a convincing explanation for the economic crises of the 1970s and how to deal with the problems of union strikes and hyperinflation, which ultimately allowed neoliberal ideology to triumph over the Keynesian consensus. Eurocommunism faced critiques from both Marxist purists as well as political pragmatists. As you can probably expect, many ultra-left Marxists believe that working within liberal democratic systems compromised the revolutionary essence of Marxism. It was revisionist, prioritizing reform over the radical overhaul of capitalism entirely. The revolutionary overthrow of the bourgeoisie, critics saw Eurocommunist reliance on electoral success as a big weakness, making it vulnerable to the limits of parliamentary politics and alliances with centrist parties, which some viewed as a betrayal of working-class interests. Others, the more Marxist-Leninist hardliners, the Tankies, condemned Eurocommunism's rejection of Soviet leadership and Marxist-Leninist ideology in general, claiming that it weakened international solidarity, even though, keep in mind, the Soviet Union didn't want to back revolution, so I don't really get this point. For its critics, Eurocommunism represented a dilution of Marxist principles, a movement stuck between revolution and reform, leaving it without a clear path forward. But for others who consider themselves to be more pragmatic, it was just more viable and desirable than the Soviet approach. And it was really the only possible way, given that revolution just didn't happen in these countries. Ultimately, Eurocommunism would be replaced by democratic socialist movements and by more moderate social democratic movements, as the word communism became increasingly out of fashion. However, nowadays, the dilution of left-wing parties in Europe has created a sort of meme that goes around Europe that the social democratic parties are now the neoliberal parties, and that the democratic socialist parties are the real social democratic parties, and that the communist parties are the real democratic socialist parties. And who are the real communist parties then? Well, they're usually not even part of a party or part of very fringe parties that don't have any seats in parliament, or don't even believe in participating in the parliamentary process and opting for a revolution despite having no army whatsoever. Next up, we got another Western variant of Marxism, cleverly titled Western Marxism. Western Marxism is one of these very vague categories. If you Google types of Marxism online, it appears as one of the categories. The category of Western Marxism was first popularized by the veteran Marxist scholar Perry Anderson. But some of you might have heard the term Western Marxism more recently from the book by Domenico Lazzordo. Western Marxism is often used in a pejorative way by Marxists who are disgruntled with the fact that Marxism never really succeeded in the West, while ostensibly succeeding in the East. As a result, there's this idea that the Eastern left is so successful, while the Western left is not.
You're failures!
Usually the type of Marxists that are lumped into this vague category of Western Marxism are more so Marxist intellectuals rather than Marxist revolutionaries. The category usually includes Marxist academics who were more so interested in adding to Marxist theory to reinterpret the world rather than putting it into practice to change it. This Western Marxist canon usually includes 20th century theorists like Georgi Lukács and the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is famous for posing the burning question: why didn't Marx's prediction about capitalism collapsing and being replaced by a communist revolution in first world countries come true? They looked at various different factors, but they centered a lot on culture and ideology, forces that shaped human consciousness.
Ideology?
They argued that capitalism didn't just dominate the economy, it also shaped how we thought, how we felt. Think of it this way: capitalism isn't just your paycheck. It's your Netflix queue, your Instagram feed, and even the whole way you define success. It shapes your very thought process. Another thinker who is often included in this category is Antonio Gramsci, even though he was writing much before the Frankfurt School. This is largely due to his concept of cultural hegemony. Gramsci argued that the ruling class doesn't just control through brute force alone or by laws. It controls by shaping the cultural norms that we take for granted. This would heavily inspire thinkers in the Frankfurt School, like Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which we've covered on this channel before. Basically, Western Marxist is all about explaining why Marxism didn't work rather than trying to make Marxism work again. Posadism. Imagine being such a hardcore communist that you actually believe that alien civilizations must be socialist and that therefore a nuclear war would actually be good for humanity. Sounds like a fake ideology, right? Nobody must believe that. Well, meet J. Posadis. Posadism is a highly fringe and obscure variant of Trotskyism, named after J. Posadis, an Argentine theorist alive in the mid-20th century, who developed somewhat of a following. While it is seen largely as a meme ideology today, it was once an actual ideology that people in Latin America believed. Not that many, but a significant amount. While Posadism originally started as just a typical Latin American Marxist movement in the 1950s, it took quite a bizarre turn when this Posadist guy began arguing that any aliens capable of interstellar travel must have evolved beyond capitalism and would have evolved towards something like socialism, and that they could potentially help humans on Earth achieve socialism. Even more controversially, he suggested that nuclear apocalypse might accelerate capitalism's demise. He was sort of like a proto-accelerationist. Although Posadism had a little bit of steam, it pretty much died completely by the 1970s. What was once a product of Cold War and the new emergence of alien conspiracy theories sort of got resurrected in recent years as a internet meme, becoming a sort of ironic symbol for radical leftists dreaming of utopian alternatives in an age of climate doom and late-stage capitalism. And that's all I gotta say about Posadism, because this is not really an important ideology, guys, you know? Let's not give it too much time. Post-Marxism? Isn't that kind of antithetical to this video? Is that even a type of Marxism? Well, it's certainly worth mentioning, because post-Marxism includes people who are certainly highly influenced by Marxism and were usually former Marxists, but believed in retaining some aspects of Marxism while abandoning it as a doctrine. Post-Marxism represents a departure from doctrinaire Marxism's more rigid economic determinism.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
At its core, post-Marxist tendencies critique the traditional Marxist belief that the economic base dictates the political and cultural superstructure, as they call it. The most famous thinkers associated with this category are Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, who are responding to the fall of the Soviet Union and the broader disillusionment with communist ideas. They instead advocated for a form of radical left populism. But they were different from Eurocommunism in that they didn't frame this around Marxist theory anymore. Post-Marxists generally want to go beyond just class struggle and see the importance of incorporating gender, race, and other categories. They also tend to abandon Marxism as a whole when it comes to the signifiers they use. They prefer signifiers like radical democracy over communism. The text most famously associated with Laclau and Mouffe is called Hegemony in Socialist Strategy, a hotly contested text in the field of post-Marxism. Now, while the category of post-Marxism does include types like this who are more on the reformist end, it also includes people like Alain Badiou, who, as he described himself, was a communist but not a Marxist. Basically, he had a commitment to the communist ideal, but didn't think that Marxism as a grand narrative, as a theory of everything, was necessary in order to strive for communism. The category of post-Marxism also includes people like Slavoj Žižek, who are sort of in this awkward position of being much more radical than reformists, but definitely being way more moderate than radical revolutionaries. In fact, he's been chastised by many Marxists for not being Marxist enough and being anti-communist. Some critics of post-Marxism assert that its rejection of essentialism, especially in the notion of the universal working class subject, risks fragmenting leftist politics into a bunch of disparate identities that can't build solidarity with each other. Critics of this variety are very critical of intersectionality, for example. They believe in a more universal signifier like the working class, like communism, instead of different struggles. However, those in the post-Marxist camp believe that these people are out of touch and stuck in the 20th century. Now, critics like Goran Thurnborn are very hostile to the attack on materialism and believe that post-Marxism's rejection of historical materialism as a grand view of history tends to result in a kind of politics that is without a scientific rigor. Now, while post-Marxism is not a coherent ideology that you can judge in the same way that you can evaluate many of the other ideologies that we discussed in this video, post-Marxism as a way of thinking, as a way of approaching politics, is useful in the sense that it takes a more pluralistic approach as opposed to relying on Marxism as a theory to explain everything and classify one's identity. The post-Marxist camp also includes post-structuralism and post-modernism. We really don't have time to discuss. That's a whole can of worms. You can check out some of these videos on the screen about that. Some people like Jean Baudrillard and Michel Foucault tend to be called post-Marxists, and they get a lot of hate for kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because if you don't have a big epic view of history and a clear revolutionary subject, how are you going to mobilize people other than just have a bunch of disparate identity categories with no basis in a broader historical struggle? Now, many post-Marxists would still be influenced by Marxist work and invoke it at times, but they would no longer be doctrinaire Marxists. Many of them would end up either becoming social democrats or joining a broader Democratic Socialist coalition, a Big Ten organization like the DSA, for example, or the Popular Front in France. And this brings us to the distinction between democratic socialism and social democracy. Alright, now we have come full circle. We've gone through all of the most niche variants of Marxism only to come back to normie socialism. And I think it's quite fitting that we come full circle back to normie socialism because I do notice a pattern with people who get very invested in all this Marxism stuff that changes as they get older.
I've made a huge mistake.
What happens is that they first get into socialism through democratic socialism or social democratic reformism, like, Bernie Sanders, AOC, something like that. And as they get deeper and deeper into leftist theory and begin to learn more about the history of socialism, they usually end up picking and choosing one of the various ideologies that we described in this video, or some form of anarchism. This temporarily will give them meaning and belonging, but over time they start to see the limitations and all the cracks in this sectarianism and start to be less committed to any ideological label. They often come to the realization that most of these ideologies were created in the 20th century. Many of them went nowhere, and the communist parties that did succeed politically were a mixed bag to say the least. It then becomes clear to these people that we need something new, not merely adopt and tweak these ideologies of the past. But at the same time, we shouldn't just discard all ideas of the past. So people end up coming full circle and get back into the democratic socialist camp. For all its flaws, social democracy, didn't kill tons of people and create miserable regimes. So many of these people end up coming full circle and get back into democratic socialism and end up joining an organization like the DSA. I was debating on putting this section at the very beginning because after all it is one of the most famous types of socialisms, but I decided to keep it for the end because its relationship to Marxism is quite ambiguous. Today, democratic socialism is probably the most mainstream form of socialism. It's the one that the normies first get drawn to. However, social democracy and democratic socialism, despite their similar sounding names, represent fundamentally different political visions. So let's clear up a persistent confusion. Social democracy versus democratic socialism. What's different? Social democracy basically wants to make capitalism more bearable. Think the Nordic-style welfare states with universal healthcare, strong labor protections, and robust social programs, all while maintaining the core capitalist framework of private ownership and market competition. It's sort of like putting a leash on capitalism rather than putting it down. Social democrats believe that they can tame the beast through regulation and redistribution, creating what they see as capitalism with a human face. The way they see it is that they want to get the best of both worlds. The prosperity and consumer abundance of capitalism, but also the egalitarianism and humanitarianism of socialism. Democratic socialism, on the other hand, sees capitalism itself as a problem, and they believe that it eventually needs to be overcome, not just tamed. While democratic socialists might support many of the same short-term policies as social democrats, the democratic socialists view these reforms as stepping stones towards a fundamentally different economic system, one based on social ownership and worker ownership of the means of production. The key difference between democratic socialism and social democracy is in their end goal. Social democrats want to make capitalism more equitable, while democratic socialists want to eventually move beyond it, but through democratic means, unlike the Leninist strategy. However, some socialists say that democratic socialism is a misnomer. Marxists often consider the term democratic socialism to be misleading, or a tautology, because Marxism is already supposed to be democratic. The classical Marxist position was that socialism and democracy were supposed to be necessary components of each other. One could not exist without the other. After all, Marx himself advocated for a radical form of representative democracy, which we already described in the previous video, Marxism Explained. Think of it this way. Social democrats want to modify the rules of the capitalist game to make them more fair, while democratic socialists want to change the game entirely, at least eventually. But what differentiates them from the revolutionary Marxists is that the Dem-Socs, as they're called, the democratic socialists, want to get there gradually, and through a democratic road. Even though classical Marxism saw socialism and democracy as the same thing, it was assumed that socialism was supposed to be democratic. What democratic socialists mean is using the instruments of the democratic bourgeois liberal state to get there, like elections. Now, I won't say whether this is possible or not. The revolutionary Marxists often think it's totally impossible. Marx himself was rather ambivalent on the matter. Marx thought that it might be possible for socialism to win through elections as countries became more increasingly democratic, but he was very doubtful of this prospect, mainly because in Marx's time, barely any countries were democratic in any sense. I mean, no country had universal suffrage, and at the time Marx was writing, many countries were literally ruled by the bourgeoisie. And I mean that literally, in the sense that there was property qualifications to even vote. So it literally was dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The only reason why democratic socialism became a thing is because socialists felt the need to distinguish themselves from the more authoritarian kinds of state socialisms that existed in the Soviet systems like the USSR or China. And I mean, to be fair, nowadays, especially given the aftermath of the Cold War, a lot of people feel like they need a preface that they are socialists, but not that kind. But non-Marxist, Leninist Marxists in general often don't like this distinction between democratic and non-democratic socialism because they don't believe that the systems of the Soviet Union and China were socialist in the first place. The disenchantment that was caused by the reality of what became of these Soviet systems led to the splits between the socialists who defended these systems and those who were in favor of more democratic systems. But when exactly Marxism turned into a non-democratic form of socialism is up for debate. Many say that it began with Stalin. Some say it started with Lenin. Others, mainly just the Marxist-Leninists, make the defense that these actually existing socialist regimes were always democratic through and through, but just had a different conception of democracy, Soviet democracy, and that these states were ultimately democratic because they served the people. Other thinkers, such as myself, have made the case that Marx, while clearly an advocate of radical representative democracy, in his own works had a rather insufficient theory of government and democracy in general, due to the fact that the guy just didn't live long enough and was writing in a time where liberal democracy barely had time to exist yet. I explain why Marxist theories of democracy, while useful, are ultimately insufficient in my upcoming book, Freedom to Change Nothing, which is a guide to the history of democracy and the various important thinkers who have tried to understand it. And by the end, I put forth some of my own theories. So be on the lookout for that. This brings us to the final section and the question that some of you have long been waiting for. What ideology do I subscribe to? Which of all of these tendencies do I agree with most? Okay, there you have it. We're all done. Now you've learned about every single type of Marxist adjacent ideology to exist. And although I'm sure that there's some that I have not covered yet, I really covered all the ones that actually matter. In fact, I think I covered a little too many. Some that you probably don't need to know about, but I'm sure you learned a lot regardless. So where do I stand in all of this? What is my political ideology? Which of all these political labels do I identify with? Well, none of them. First off, I'm not a fan of labels. Many people feel pressured to adopt an ideological tendency when they get into this whole leftist sphere, and I think it's a big mistake to be rushed into that. I think the correct approach is to think through all the contradictions of all of these ideologies. But people often want to adopt an ideology with pre-written answers that they think have already been thought through so that they don't have to do all this thinking because it gives them a sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning. You hear the way a lot of Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, and even anarchists talk, they talk with a sense of certainty a lot of the time. They often think that they discovered the truth. They'll say that, oh, I used to be a democratic socialist liberal reformist until I read Lenin and I discovered the truth.
Finished reading some Marxian historian.
And this is a trap that many people fall into. They think that once they read Lenin, once they read a little Marx, that they are above everyone else. And as a result, they become out of touch with people and, they end up believing in dogmas that get them nowhere. Now, at the same time, I don't think that we should just reject Marxism completely. There's a lot to learn from it. I think Marxism is a lens that can help with understanding the world and maybe even changing it. But it is one lens among many. It certainly won't explain everything, and you shouldn't expect it to. When it comes to politics, it just seems kind of silly to base your whole movement around a guy who died 200 years ago. And it might have worked if Marx was as big as, I don't know, Jesus, but he just wasn't, and neither was he trying to be. Marx was trying to create a scientific framework for analyzing the objective world, not a Bible to uncritically follow. And while revolutionaries like Lenin, Mao, and Ho Chi Minh used Marxist ideas to guide their political change in their respective countries, it would be kind of silly to call yourself a Leninist or a Maoist or a Hoxhaist or whatever, and expect to get very far in a completely different country with a very different socio-political culture, especially in countries where there is not much of a historical communist tradition and where some of these figures might straight up be unpopular and might even scare people away. Now, you can spend all the time you want trying to rehabilitate these figures and popularize these ideologies, but it's not going to get that far. If the success of your political movement depends on getting a large part of the population to conform to your specific ideology, instead of meeting them halfway where they're at, then you're pretty delusional. The best you'll get are some fringe microsects or a crazy cult, or just some people on Twitter who now have a new zaddy figure to worship. History teaches us that in order for radical political change to take place, whether through peaceful reform, violent revolution, or radical reformation, successful movements have to blend what is radically new with the traditions that are old and familiar. And all of this is highly contingent on the socioeconomic and geopolitical conditions of the time. So with this ideology video, what I hope to leave you with is some nuanced knowledge to think critically about, not just a bunch of name tags or costumes to cosplay in. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, a like, share it around. And if you are interested in supporting my work and exploring political ideas like this more deeply, then you can become a patron at patreon.com/onedime. By becoming a patron, you get access to my private Discord server, over 50 exclusive episodes of my podcast, One Dime Radio. And at the higher tiers, you can participate in reading groups, where me and other patrons read books and discuss them. Oh, and before I forget, I have an Instagram now, which you can go follow. So go follow me on Insta. Link is in the description and on the screen. I also have a Twitter, which you can follow, or X, but I don't like posting there as much. To be frank, Twitter is kind of cancerous, so I try to stay off that shit. But the best way to support me is by becoming a patron. If you just want to kind of follow me for updates, you can follow the Instagram. Big thanks to the patrons who have supported me thus far, especially these generous individuals whose names you see on the screen. See you in the next video.